SUERF, the European Money and Finance Forum, bringing together policymakers, finance, and academia.
Welcome to this workshop on measuring economic slack and shortages, new methods and way forward. This workshop has been jointly set up by SUERF, the Banco de España, the Bank of Finland, the Banca d'Italia, and the ECB. Before we start, let me express my appreciation to the members of the scientific committee who together selected the papers. Matthias Strifler from the ECB, Juha Kilponen from the Bank of Finland, Alessandro Notarpietro from the Banca d'Italia, and Eva Ortega from the Banco de España. Without further ado, let me hand over to Juha Kilponen, who will introduce the topic for us.
Thank you, Ernest, and welcome also from my behalf to this workshop. This time we will focus on how we economists try to measure the state of the business cycle, or in other words, whether the economy runs below or above its potential. One motivation for this workshop is that the recent crises have made the measurement of economic slack or shortages unusually difficult, given the multiplicity of large and different types of shocks that have hit our economies during the last years. Being able to measure the state of the business cycle is central due to its important role in devising adequate monetary, fiscal, and structural policies. For central bankers, amount of slack is also one key input in inflation forecasting. The workshop will discuss new theoretical and empirical approaches to measure potential output, labor market conditions, and other business cycle indicators. The impact of sectoral shifts and various forms of market frictions into economic slack and shortages will also be featured prominently in the presentations. We have invited to this workshop a number of presentations, actually 9 altogether, from different institutions, and I want to thank already now all the presenters for contributing to this workshop. The workshop is divided into 2 large sessions. First deals with the longer term issues, focusing on implications of supply disruption, sectoral change, and scarring effects of large shocks. The second session looks into how to measure the output gap in times of large shocks, particularly. And these sessions will be shared by Alessandro Notarpietro from Banca d'Italia and Eva Ortega from Banco de España. Without further ado, let me hand the floor over to Alessandro and wish everyone a productive and interesting webinar. Thank you. Alessandro.
Thanks, Juha. Thanks for the introduction. So welcome to the first session, and this session is going to have a long-term view about the effects of supply disruptions and sectoral change. So let's just start with the first presentation, who is going to be Deniz Igan from BIS and also from SUERF, who's going to talk about bottlenecks and supply side headwinds. So please, Deniz, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Alessandro, and thanks to Juha and Ernest also for the introduction. So I'm going to kick it off basically with a more conceptual discussion, big picture, and a little bit maybe, if you would say, if not speculative, a little bit ad hoc discussion. You're not going to see regressions or anything, but I'm going to attempt to set the stage for what it meant. The shocks that we have experienced with the pandemic and the war in Ukraine, what it meant for the global economy and how we should think about output and inflation dynamics in that environment. Now, this picture probably is not going to surprise you much. We just plot the for the majority of the global economy in various countries. We plot the headline inflation and GDP growth going back to the 60s. And one thing that strikes you would be that prior to the COVID shock, we had pretty much, low inflation, definitely, but also GDP growth itself was quite stable. We had the regular ups and downs, but we had a period of, not counting the GFC, of course, we had a period of relatively stable and respectable growth rates at a global scale. Now, what has happened since then is both growth and inflation are not behaving like we had expected them to do as in the past. So we did have a strong recovery. The bounce back was strong, of course, as it was for the downturn during the pandemic. But even with that strong recovery, real GDP is still well below pre-pandemic trend. And this is common to many of you. So it's going to remind you of this regular pattern, if you would, that some researchers, including my former colleague Sveta Saxena, had shown in various papers, saying that after big shocks, after financial crisis and other kind of big shocks, growth never goes back to trend. So there's a permanent loss in certain sense. But what I'm going to get your attention to is that even before, we had the bounce back, but even before, and I'm cutting it here, the period in 2022 on purpose, even before the additional shock delivered by the war, we had already seen growth slowing down, especially in emerging markets. This flattening has happened even before that. At the same time, as we all know, inflation made a big comeback, right? Both across countries, portion of countries with high inflation, AEs, EMEs, it has spiked, especially for AEs, of course, this is a very, very surprising development, but also it has been a very broad case of inflation, not driven only in one category, but it has started to broaden relatively fast, and it remains at very high levels when you look at the share of consumer basket that's experiencing high inflation, both in AEs and EMs again. Now, what I'm going to then suggest is that, yes, there were factors that were specific to the pandemic, and there were factors that were specific to the war that could explain why we saw this pattern, especially on inflation, but also perhaps a little bit on the growth front. But maybe there are also indicators, the developments that we have been seeing in the past 3 years are indicators of a break in what we have seen between, say, 1970s and 2000s. So let's first look at, what had triggered the inflation surge. Last year's annual economic report by the BIS has taken full-scale decomposition of what could be the factors behind, but also where we should be looking, going under the hood on inflation developments. And the three factors that were identified, and again, it's not going to surprise this audience, were both supply side, but also demand side, and the clash between the two, right? And here, as we all know, the commodity price index has gone through the roof. It has come down recently, but it had reached historical highs as inflation took off. The second thing was the supply chain pressures. It entered all our vocabulary. There again, very big disruptions, huge impact. By some counts, 30–40% of the inflation surge we have seen can be attributed to these disruptions, global value chains, but recently they are also back to normal. And the third component, so the commodity side, supply side, as it relates to GVCs, and then the demand side was the spend and rotation that we had seen, right? And here looking at most AEs, because that's where we observed it, but there was this rotation away from services related to the shutdowns, that lockdown of economies, to goods. And we have recently started seeing this also being reversed, although there's still some way to go. This is all to say, yes, there were some specific pandemic-related, war-related shocks that did create this initial surge, but now they are being reversed. And what should we expect going forward? What I'm going to argue is that we're well outside the woods still. So there's still a big chunk to go. And what is worrisome, now we will look at the characteristic of inflation in more recent periods, but also in a broader picture. What has been happening is that surge that started in goods, as you can see in the first panel here, both in AEs and EMEs, has started reverting, right? And actually in some countries, goods inflation is now a subtractor to headline inflation, but services inflation, the lighter lines, started picking up. And they started picking up quite strongly, and they seem to be going quite persistently. In the middle panel, you can see that a bit more in terms of the global, the common factor that's driving this. And what's striking here, again, doesn't come as a surprise. It is intuitive, right? Especially before the pandemic period, what we had seen in services inflation was explained less so by the common factor, but more by idiosyncratic components or country-specific factors. If you would see, it did increase during the surge, not as much as goods one did, but taken together, this A and B panels, A and B taken together, what's telling you is that services-driven inflation tends to be stickier. It's much more dependent on country-specific components, and as you can see, particularly in panel A, it has been pretty flat, whereas the variation in overall inflation was coming from variation in goods inflation. And with goods inflation going in reverse now, what we will need to watch is what's going to happen to services inflation. If it sticks at those high levels, then we are looking into a sticky inflation, persistent inflation. The last point here is that when we look at different sectors, the one thing that also pops out is that services is primarily wages, right? The labor share in these industries is much larger than it is for manufacturing, especially goods manufacturing. And that brings the price-wage dynamics, how they will feed on each other, and brings me to the labor markets. Labor market tightness we've been talking about for a long time. Again, maybe it was about pandemic, right? Or maybe it was something else that just manifested itself more strongly or earlier than what would have happened even in the absence of the pandemic. We looked at different countries here, and especially for the US and in the UK, it looks like we do have a shift in the beverage curve, which generally we interpret as some kind of skill mismatch. But another way to think about it is this is consistent with an adverse supply shock in labor markets, that shift in the beverage curve. And what I'm going to argue, and that's why I was saying, the speculative part, this is no accident. Yes, it has happened in the context of the pandemic, in the aftermath of the pandemic, but maybe it was all in the coming because of the demographics of what was going on in advanced economies as well as emerging markets. All know the working age population has peaked in several countries. Most remarkable, perhaps, is the China case because of the Chinese labor force being a global source until recently. Now, then I'm going to link this demographics story that was in the coming with something else, because labor, capital, and productivity growth drives growth, right? And productive growth itself has been very difficult to keep up, even before the pandemic. And this is particularly the case in advanced economies. And you go back to the 60s, 70s, the burst there, and then the gradual slowdown and continuing to slow down, and we have not seen much of a recovery. And you may have seen some headlines, some recent data, especially in the US, shows that productivity growth is actually collapsing. So how do we deal with that? Where growth is going to come from is the other factor to consider. So let me finish by this chart and this thought. So what has happened, we argue, in the general managers, BIS general managers, Jackson Hole's speech last year, is that as growth drivers, the tailwinds to growth continue to turn into tailwinds, looking into demographics, looking into technology spillovers, looking into productivity and structural reforms. What has happened is that policymakers had to push the economy through more debt creation, right? That's how we experienced the GFC after a globally driven credit boom. But this is, more generally, you can see that as GDP growth continued to decline and inflation continued to decline, what we had is both public and private debt keeping to reaching new levels, new high levels in these economies, partly as a result of the very aggressive monetary and fiscal policies pushing growth and pushing the economy to its borders. What we hadn't seen in the past is inflation didn't pick up, right? And the reason we argue was because of the favorable conditions on the demographics part, favorable conditions on the globalization and technology, and now those are also gone. And we might be looking at a period of low growth, yet high inflation. Let me stop here.
Thanks a lot, Deniz, for the very interesting presentation and the excellent time management. So we'll move to the second presentation. Speaker is going to be Katalin Bodnar from the ECB, who's going to talk about the impact of the COVID shock on euro area potential output. Please, Katalin, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I will present a paper that I wrote together with my colleagues, whose name appeared on the first slide of this presentation. And this will focus on the impact of the COVID-19 shock on the euro area potential output. But instead of the normal approaches, we took a sectoral approach. Before I start explaining this, I would like to mention a disclaimer, which is that the official potential output estimates of the ECB are prepared by the Eurosystem and are confidential, so I will not be able to talk about them. You will hear a presentation about it in a while. There's also an unobserved components model that embeds a production function, and it is used at the ECB to internally benchmark the official estimates. But the method that I will present here is a different approach and should not be interpreted as the official potential output estimate of the Eurosystem. I would like to explain the motivation for this project, and it was that, especially in real time, the scaling effects of the COVID-19 shock seemed to be very uncertain, and this was due to the fact that the shock and also the policy response affected sectors very heterogeneously. And this is why it was deemed necessary to have a look at the sectoral estimates of trend developments in order to assess the scaling effects of the crisis, but also to attach some kind of narrative to it, and also to forecast potential output and to assess the risks along different scenarios, and finally to evaluate the sectoral reallocation process. So in order to answer these questions, we developed a novel approach. It is based on a shock identification on the sectoral level, and this is combined with a metric for the scaling of this of the supply shock to potential output. And this was used to assess the impact of the pandemic on the potential output on the aggregate euro area level. Our key findings are that even before the pandemic, the growth of trend output was heterogeneous across the euro area sectors. And in 2020 and 2021, we found that supply shocks, which are normally thought to be related more to trend developments, had a larger role in some sectors, namely in those ones which could not operate without personal contacts and which were deemed to be less essential. But also the pass-through of these supply shocks to trend output was different across the sectors. We found the risk of scaling to be larger in these contact-intensive sectors, but also in industry and construction. On the aggregate level, we found that there were downside risks to the available real-time potential growth projections and upside risks to the losses because of this. And also we found that the policy response was very important. Now with this, I would like to explain you a little bit our methodology. First of all, how our baseline estimates were derived. So when we look at potential output on the aggregate level, then the first step is of course always to estimate the contributions of labor and capital to the GDP growth, and then we treat the residual as the total factor productivity. We estimate the trend developments from all these factors of production, and then we aggregate up the trends again to get the potential output estimate. And this is what we also followed for the sectors. So we took the labor and capital data. The difference from the aggregate methodology is that for labor we considered the total hours worked instead of all the different margins of adjustment. And first, we estimated trend output for the past using a Hedrick-Prescott filter for TFP and labor. But in case of capital, we didn't filter the data because this is also the approach we follow for the aggregate potential output. Then for the 2 years, which were most affected by the crisis, we found it very challenging to separate the trend and the cycle. And we had some data issues, but the main difficulty was that the statistical filters, also other filters, but in particular statistical filters, have difficulties distributing a trend and cycle when there's a big shock at the end of the time period. And on top of that, we could also not leverage on the economic relationships because those were broken due to the shock and the policy responses. Sorry. So, for example, the Phillips curve relationship was broken. And our approach was to use a Bayesian VAR model to decompose the change in the sectoral value added to supply and demand. So for this, we only use 2 variables, the sectoral value added and the sectoral value added deflated. And in the second step, we derived a metric which reflected the elasticity of the sectoral trends to the supply shock and used this to assess the trend developments. And we did this because we know that not the entire supply shock affects the trends. When we carried out these steps, after this, we assumed that there would be a gradual convergence to the counterfactual path, where the counterfactual path was derived such that the sum of the sectoral trends would give up the pre-pandemic potential output path. For capital, we used a different approach where we estimated a panel regression using sectoral value-added data. Of course, there are a lot of drawbacks of this approach, and this is why we carried out a lot of robustness checks. For example, we had a cross-checking exercise with the so-called sectoral resilience index. So the benefit of this sectoral resilience index is that it is a combination of 3 indices or 3 indicators, each of which is related to one factor of production. But the disadvantage is that it was not available as a time series. So we assumed that this index is related to the resilience of the sector, and through the resilience, it could be related to the persistence of the shock, but we couldn't test it for the past. And this is why this is only a cross-checking scenario. But ex post, we indeed found that there is such a link between the index and the persistence of the shock. And we used this index to adjust the share of the supply shock, which is passed through on potential output, and also the persistence of the shock. I wouldn't like to go through all these robustness checks, but just to mention that we also had an NG-EU scenario because the new generation EU support was very important, and we assessed that or assumed that it would counterbalance some of the scarring effects of the pandemic shock. And we used some assumptions on how this package would affect the different sectors and the different factors of production. So our findings. First of all, we found that the past trend growth was very heterogeneous across the sectors. This is shown on this left-hand side chart. For example, the red line shows the information and communication sector, which had a very high trend growth throughout our sample. But on the other end of the spectrum, the construction sector had a very low trend growth, and it was even negative for a long period after the global financial crisis. And this was reassuring, this finding, because it was also in line with what we expected. And also, we found that the contribution of the different factors of production was different across the sectors. For example, information and communication is driven by the TFT component, professional and administrative services by the labor. And so all these findings were, again, in line with our expectations. And this was also our starting point for the projection. On the next slide, I will explain our findings for the pandemic period and beyond. So the yellow line here shows this counterfactual scenario for all the sectors. And we compare the baseline projection to this yellow line. And what we want to see is whether the blue line, the baseline projection, is below the counterfactual and for how long. So this is in terms of growth rates. which means that if the blue line is below the yellow line, then there is a negative impact from the crisis on the trend growth of the sectors and also on the level, and the growth rate converges back to the pre-pandemic or the counterfactual scenario, which is like this by setup. But there is a permanent loss in case the baseline projection doesn't go above the counterfactual. So we need a rebalancing in order to cover up the losses in the levels, which doesn't happen in most of the sectors in our analysis. So, for example, if we look at these other services sectors, which is at the end of the chart, this includes many services which are based on personal contact, so hairdressers and libraries and sports services. And this was affected to a large degree by the lockdowns. And indeed, the trend growth went down, according to our estimate, considerably, and it even went to negative in this COVID period, and then it recovered to this slow trend growth. The same happened in trade, transport, and accommodation, which is basically hotels and restaurants, although also retail trade. And also we see similar developments in industry and construction. And when we sum up the deviation between the two lines on the previous chart for all the years, then we can see the sectoral losses. And this is shown on this chart. And again, for these strongly contact-intensive services sectors, we see a large degree of sectoral losses, but also in industry and construction, we estimated large losses. And these are basically coming from all the factors of production, but capital seems to have a larger role in it. Now, what do we see when we aggregate up our results? So this is also very important. Here, the yellow line on the left-hand side chart shows our baseline, so the aggregate of the sectoral results. And we compare this first to a counterfactual scenario, which is basically coming from the pre-pandemic potential output estimates, and also to the European Commission's 2021 autumn forecast, which is the blue line. There are a couple of observations here. So first of all, European Commission projection starts from a lower level in 2019. And this is because, so this is growth rate, right? So it starts from lower growth rate. And this is because when filters are applied to estimate the impact of the pandemic, the filters smoothen, so they also affect the pre-pandemic observations. So our baseline starts from a higher starting point, but then it goes below the European Commission forecasts and remains below that. So we estimated a more negative impact from this sectoral approach than the European Commission taking an aggregate approach. But when we update this chart with the European Commission's latest potential output estimate, which is this dark dashed line, then the two estimates, so our baseline and the European Commission, are much more closer to each other. Of course, there are several factors which are not included in our estimates and are included in the European Commission estimate. So, for example, the war, which had a negative impact on potential output, but also we had some positive shocks which are not in our baseline. For example, the positive impact on digitalization, but most significantly the NGEU support. When turning to the right-hand side chart, here we see the different scenarios that I explained before, and all of them are below the European Commission projection, but the NGEU scenario is closest to it. On the next slide, we also show this. So the range of the potential output growth estimates according to our method was below the European Commission real-time estimate. And because of this, because we don't have an overshooting in our estimation, the losses are also significant. Even by 2025, we are below the pre-pandemic path, while the European Commission in 2021 expected some overshooting. So they expected, because of the NGEU mainly, that there would be even gains due to the or after the pandemic. And finally, a few words on sectoral reallocation. This is a little bit complicated. topic, and but the way we looked at it was that we assessed the change in the share of the sectors, and this is how we understood sectoral reallocation. Overall, many factors affect this, but mainly the trend growth before the pandemic, the change of the weight, but these changes of the weight are very small, and also the size of the sectors, which are shown by the size of these bubbles. And when we take all these factors into account, then we see a negative impact from this sectoral reallocation, and this is mainly because there are several so the sectors which gained from the pandemic are really small, and they cannot counterbalance the negative impact from the other sectors. So to sum up, we developed a novel approach to estimate the potential output as an aggregation of sectoral trends. We believe that this is a flexible tool and it can be developed further, also with further assumptions. We estimated the downside risk to the available real-time potential output growth estimates and losses in some services sectors in particular. And we couldn't take into account the upside risks which were linked to the positive implication for potential growth from a boost in technology adoption. And we believe that this methodology can be used in the future to assess the impact of other sector-specific shocks. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Katalin. Thanks a lot for your very interesting presentation. So we'll move to the third speaker of this session, who is David Aikman from King's College London.
Thank you very much indeed, Alessandro. And thanks to the organisers for putting our paper on the programme. I really appreciate it. So this is joint work with my colleagues Matthias Strifler, Mikhail Giselius and Xiaochuan Jing. Let me dive straight in. Slides. Okay, so I mean, to put this in context a little bit, so you had two really nice presentations just then, one about the current conjuncture and the other about COVID-19 and its impact on supply. This paper is going to be a little bit broader, so we're not going to look at a particular episode, but we're going to look more generally at the impact of contractions and when do we see scarring and when don't we. So I'll say a few words of introduction. So I'd say it's fairly well appreciated now that economies can experience contractions that are characterized by non-linearities and scarring effects. The global financial crisis, I think, is the kind of best known recent example, and you saw that very nice chart in Deniz's presentation illustrating that episode. And there's also, this is attracting a lot more work in academia at the moment. There's a very nice survey paper that many of you will have seen by Valerie Chera and co-authors in the Journal of Economic Literature. But I would say there's still quite a lot we don't understand about the conditions for scarring to occur. So some of the questions we were interested in when we started working on this paper are as follows. So is it the case that economies typically recover after contractions? Is that the norm or not? Are big contractions different to smaller ones? Are expansions different to contractions? And then is there anything about the kind of nature of the contraction that really matters for driving the possibility of scarring? So what we do in this paper is, well, we build on a large literature that I'm not going to survey for you here given the time, but we develop a new statistical test for scarring that's going to be based on the properties of long horizon growth rates. And it's a super simple test, which I'll describe to you in a minute. We apply that test to a panel of advanced and emerging economies, and we really report, I'd say, two key results. So the first one is we find that it's only the really deep contractions that generate scarring effects. So our results are really, I would say, they're both non-linear and asymmetric in this regard. So we don't find scarring over smaller contractions. And we also don't find what's sometimes called in the literature reverse scarring, so positive effects of expansions. So it's a one-sided effect that only kicks in for the very largest contractions. And then the second result is, this seems to be quite a robust finding in our case, that it's the size of the contraction, like how big the initial fall in output is, that's the best predictor of whether scarring will occur. That's more important than whether the crisis is associated with something happening in the financial system, or with monetary policy, or with oil shocks. And I'll show you some results to demonstrate that. Right, let me kick right off, and I'll explain the method via this very simple chart that you can see on the screen. So I want you to think about the black line here as being, let's say, log of real GDP, and the economy is developing along nicely until the point T0, at which point there's a large contraction that hits the economy. And then there's basically two possibilities from that point onwards. The economy can either grow as it was doing, and that's the case on the left, and in that case we'll have a permanent shock to GDP, so just so we're clear on the language. And the other case is we can have a period of catch-up growth, so more accelerated growth than the historical trend, and that way we see a transitory impact on the level of GDP. So that's the case on the right. Now, the idea for our test is really simple as the following. So let's think about the points T0 on the charts. You're standing on the top of the cliff, right? You're looking down at the recession that's about to occur. Now, let's imagine we take a long horizon growth rate from that point onwards, from the top of the cliff, okay? Now, as long as that the horizon of that growth rate is long enough, we should then be able to distinguish between the permanent case and the transitory case. So if that growth rate looks very similar to all the other growth rates in our sample, we would say that's a transitory shock that's occurred. The economy has eventually recovered its pre-shock trend. And by contrast, the other cases where that long horizon growth rate from the top of the cliff is a little bit lower than the rest of the sample, that's what you'd find in the case of a permanent shock. So our test is basically going to be, we're going to look to see whether the mean of the H period ahead, I'll call it H being the horizon, so H period ahead growth rates from the set of points T0, from these tops of the cliff points, is it significantly lower than the mean of all the other growth rates in our sample? So that's the kind of the crux of the approach. Before I show you the results, let me just highlight a couple of questions that might be in your mind. So firstly, there are issues about implementing this test. So how do we come up with the set of points T0? We're going to do something super simple. We'll take an agnostic approach here. So we'll base this on percentiles of the annual growth distribution. Okay, and I'll show you that in a second. We've tried a few different approaches. It doesn't seem to matter too much. The other choice we need to make to implement this test is we need to pick a value of the horizon H that we're calculating this long horizon growth rate for. Again, this isn't going to matter too much as long as H is large enough. So there's obviously going to be a trade-off. If we make it too long, we'll throw away lots of data. And if it's too short, it won't be enough time to look through any transitory shocks. So we'll use 10 years as our baseline, but picking another value around that point won't matter too much. A couple of other things that may be in your mind. So one would be, one possible source of bias that we could confront here and could scupper this approach would be if it was the case that contractions typically follow booms in the data. You might think intuitively that might be what's happening. So if that was the case, as I've illustrated on the chart here, if you were looking at the top of the cliff, you might find that the growth rate from that point is a little bit lower than the rest of the sample, but you wouldn't call that a permanent shock. It's more a return to the pre-boom trend, if you like. So to deal with that issue, we're going to follow an approach advocated by Blanchard and co-authors, and we're just going to wind back the period from where we calculate the growth rate from. So instead of T0, we'll look 2 or 3 years before that point onwards, and that should help us look through any booms in the data. So that's one point. And then the second thing that might be in your minds is, well, there's a well-documented slowdown in trend growth in many countries. So how does that affect this type of test? And here, I think it's a little bit more subtle. The bias is a bit unclear, so it could go in either direction. It is true that from any point, looking forwards, you'll typically have a lower growth rate if there's been a growth slowdown. So that would bias in favor of scarring. On the other hand, we'll use a full sample to calculate the normal times growth rate, and any growth slowdown will therefore be a bit lower because it'll incorporate those future slower growth rates. That will bias against finding scarring. So we're going to look at lots of different filtering approaches to see whether it matters for the results. And the answer is no. Okay, let me kind of jump in then. So the data here is a very simple paper from a data point of view. We calculate growth rates using real GDP, seasonally adjusted from 1970 Q1. The baseline results I'll show you run just up to the point of COVID, but I'll show you what effect that has as well. And you can see the list of countries. I won't read them out. It's a majority of advanced economies, but we have some emerging markets in there as well. All right, one slide on the slightly more technical description of the method then, if you prefer this. So the object we're going to start off with is this H period ahead growth rate of real GDP, and that's defined as I've got it here. So it's the log difference in the level of GDP of country I, that's T plus H relative to T. So think about this as a forward-looking growth rate rather than the normal backward-looking definition. What we do then is we apply a slow-moving trend to deal with any kind of growth slowdown type effects as I described. So the baseline results I'll show you use a HP filter with a very high value of lambda, which means we're really just picking out very, very slow-moving developments in the trend. But we've done robustness results where we don't do detrending at all. We apply the Hamilton filter or a moving average, and I can show you that if we have time. Step 2 then is we're going to normalize each one of these detrended growth rate series by subtracting the country-specific mean and dividing by the country-specific standard deviation. So we'll then have a series of growth rates that's detrended, and it's in terms of the country's own standard deviation. So we've normalized by volatility, in other words. Step 2 then is we're going to initially focus on the annual growth rates of that series we've calculated, and we're going to group together developments according to the percentile they kind of fit in terms of the annual distribution. So we'll group together events that are below the 5th percentile. They're going to be the most severe annual growth contractions in our data sets, and then we'll do the same thing in buckets of 5. And in the interest of time, let me just say, we'll then calculate the 10-year ahead growth rates, and the test is whether that is different from the average 10-year ahead growth rate in the sample. So let me show you some results. The key results in the paper are really summarized in this chart. So walk you through it briefly. So we have severity on the horizontal axis. So the 0 to 5 bucket on the left, that's the kind of 5% most severe contractions in the data. And then the y-axis is impact. So this is the mean estimated difference in mean growth rates following these particular events compared to the average growth rate in the sample. And the key finding really is, if you look at the 0 to 5 buckets, we find that 10-year ahead growth is almost a whole standard deviation weaker from that point onwards than it is on average across the sample. That translates into almost a 5% hit to the level of real GDP. And you can see that this effect is nonlinear, so it dies away for smaller contractions. So we only see this permanent effect for contractions up to around the 20th percentile. All right, the next thing we can do, and I'll just show you the chart walking you through this, is we can associate particular contractions with different types of events. So there's many studies out there that try to document financial crises. We know when the oil price shocks were. We also look at cases where monetary policy was tightening aggressively. And again, this is the 5th percentile results, so the kind of most severe contractions. And the headline finding really is that the nature of the contraction doesn't really matter very much. So the chart I showed you a second ago, that's the all case, that was the one standard deviation effect we find for these most severe contractions. We find similar types of results depending on whether it's crises or recessions caused by monetary policy or energy price shocks. And I think I have about 2 minutes left. So let me kind of, in a nutshell, I'll just say to you that looking at expansions, we find we don't see the same effect. So when we condition on the largest of expansions in our data sets, this is the case on the right-hand side of this chart, we don't find that they have a permanent impact in the same way as contractions do. So this is a distinctly asymmetric phenomenon. And I won't show you robustness, but I'm happy to talk about this if you have questions. But we basically look at different splits of the data, different ways of doing the detrending, and different ways of defining large contractions. And you basically see the same pattern in each of these cases. So let me just conclude with a slide of potential policy implications, which may be interesting for this audience. And these are kind of in the spirit of this famous quote from Blanchard again around the time of the GFC, where he talked about the need to stay away from the dark corners of macroeconomics. I think that chimes with what we're showing you here. So I think I'll draw out 3 implications. The first one is maybe an obvious one, which is to beware of developments that we think have predictive power about large contractions being in train. So a credit boom being one example, and that heightens the need for stress testing and macroprudential policies. I think more speculatively, our results suggest it may be important to think about asymmetric policy responses to booms versus busts, both on the monetary policy side and the fiscal policy side. And then I think the results also have obvious implications for metrics like the output gap if they're conditioned on an assumption that GDP will return to its trend. Let me stop there. Thank you very much, Alessandro.
Thank you, David, for your very interesting presentation and also excellent time management. So let's move to the 4th and last paper of this session. Speaker is Michaela Elfsbacka-Schmöller. Hope I'm not mispronouncing your last name, from Bank of Finland, who's going to talk about, again, scaring effect from a structural model point of view.
Thank you very much for including my paper into the presentation. So I basically have structured the presentation as follows. So first of all, I would like to talk about hysteresis and TFP and the long-run trend effects more broadly from this class of models that I'm presenting today, and especially with insight of the implications for the measurement of potential output, the underlying modeling approaches and how they differ from the standard framework, and the mechanisms of scarring effects, particularly also focusing on supply shocks in this context. And then I'm also talking about the long-run effects of fiscal policy in this environment, as they are generally the main focus of this paper, but I will first start with the more general mechanisms in this setting. So I guess we have seen this chart today in one form or the other before. Here I'm plotting the real GDP path for the euro area and the trend shifts following the double-dip recession in 2008, followed by the sovereign debt crisis. So, and what you can see here is that real GDP, basically following this, the initial output drop, never reverted back to its initial trend path. And this event, at the same time, it was accompanied by a pro-cyclical further deceleration of productivity growth, TFP growth in this environment. And I mean, I'm plotting this chart now for the euro area, but you can plot this for the US, and this has been studied also predominantly for the US, and you can show this pattern for a host of countries, as will be also a bit on my next slide. And in general, so this trend shift was prevalent throughout many advanced economies, nearly all of them, and at the same time characterized by further intensification of TFP. And if you take this to the data and you study it structurally, you can also show that it's not just a question of longer run structural outcomes, but you can really also demonstrate that that there's a significant part of TFP which evolves pro-cyclically, and also which has been driven during these episodes by crisis-induced shocks, as for instance our paper shows for the euro area, but other papers have also shown for the US in this context. Now, if you go back to the standard model framework, the standard DSGE setup, it cannot rationalize these dynamics, because as also came out and was pointed out by some of the earlier presenters, we typically think that TFP always goes back to its initial trend path because we do not model technology endogenously. There's also no room, and also even by assumption, we rule out that the trend may adjust in the context of a recession. Now, this is, however, also has severe implications for how we think of potential output and the output gap, because if we estimate potential output or assess potential output and the output gap based on methods which impose the strict exogeneity assumption of the trend path, we will see biases in potential output, and we will see biases in the output gap and related measures of economic slack. And again, like this is a story which the procyclicality of TFP and the crisis-induced movement of TFP, it's a story which holds across countries. It's observable for the US. It's observable for the UK in particular, and also within the euro area, it's, for instance, not a story of southern economies which were particularly hit, but it's observable throughout countries, as I'm trying to show in this table in a stylized way. And yeah, so I don't have time to go through the literature, but I just would like to emphasize here that these mechanisms have been addressed more and more increasingly in the past, both theoretically by means of DSGE models which modeled trend growth endogenously and no longer resort to the exogenous trend assumption. But also there's more and more increasing empirical evidence on the topic, both using aggregate time series following contractionary monetary policy shocks, for instance, also or more broadly studying the long-run effects of recessions in this setting. And we also have a paper using microdata in which we show this also at the firm level. And in general, like as also this paper is going to show, like fiscal policy works different in this environment, and there's a growing empirical literature also and modeling literature as well, which shows these effects in the data as well. And I don't want to go through too much on the underlying features of the model, but just to see what's underlying here. So I'm working with a medium-scale DSGE model, otherwise very standard, like in Smets and Wouters and Cristiano and co-authors, with cover price and wage rigidities and a monetary policy rule, which may be constrained by the zero lower bound. And within this framework, trend dynamics are incorporated endogenously following the Comyn and Gertler 2006 AER mechanism, in which you have two layers of technology growth, two layers of trend growth. First of all, innovation through R&D and technology adoption, which then matches diffusion lags, basically from creating a new technology to directly measurable productivity effects at the firm level or the TFP level. And within the setting, I'm studying the transmission of different fiscal policy tools, government spending, but also novel fiscal policy tools in the DSGE setup, namely transitory growth enhancing fiscal support to R&D and technology adoption. And there's also a section on monetary fiscal interaction here, but I will focus on the former two in this presentation. So yeah, again, like TFP usually is just a black box in the standard DSGE models, modeled in the form of a shock, and as a result, the transitory shock can have no long-run effects because we do not model the trend, so that long-run trend effects through TFP are ruled out by assumption technically. But now with this two-tier structure incorporating insights from endogenous growth theory, following Romer, following the seminal work by Romer, and basically this framework departs from this assumption and incorporates the trend endogenously. And as will come out, there's now a room for cycle-trend interaction in this setting. And well, like if you look into the drivers of scarring, thinking of demand shocks, which were the key issue in the past, but also supply shocks in this context, where if you basically study both demand and supply shocks in this framework, what the key message which comes out here in terms of economic dynamics is that both types of shocks can lead to scarring on the trend margin, and scarring on the TFP margin, and the main mechanism, irrespectively of the size of the source of the shock, is that it will induce the drop in aggregate output will result in a pro-cyclical drop in our pro-cyclical drop in the investment in R&D, in the investment in technology adoption, and as a result in a drop in TFP relative to its initial trend path. And let me emphasize also that this is not mean reverting in the sense that this drop in TFP is permanent. And going back to the very initial chart, this basically means that after some time employment reverts back to its initial trend level, and all other variables revert back to its initial trend level, but not not TFP, and this induces the level shift in aggregate output, as we've seen before. Now, while we in the past have focused a lot on demand-driven recessions, I want to emphasize, based on this slide, that this is also a possibility in an adverse supply shock in this environment, with the key difference being here the opposite sign on the inflation response, because under a supply-driven recession, as shown here in red, you will see inflationary pressures and at the same time scarring. So that means inflationary supply shocks give, from the perspective of this framework, a trade-off for policy in terms of inflation and output stabilization, not just over the short, but also over the long run in terms of the trend in this setting. And again, like I want to briefly also work out a little bit more the implications for the measurement of potential output and the output gap from the perspective of this class of models and this work more generally. So as we've seen, like there's a possibility for that recessions lead to a pro-cyclical slowdown in TFP and a drop in the long-run trend path. And if you then think about it, it means that to some extent there is a measure of slack on the TFP margin, which is completely ruled out in standard models. And if you do that, you will, if you make this assumption, you will result in a biased potential output estimate and in a biased output gap measure using conventional measures. And also there's a role for demand supply spillovers, because short-run aggregate demand does influence long-run aggregate supply in this setting. That's another implication, importantly also for macroeconomic stabilization. And as I just said, supply shocks can have long-run effects. So you can see inflationary pressures very well and at the same time still be subject to scarce to long-run aggregate supply. And as I said, this poses a trade-off between inflation and output stabilization beyond what we see typically, because now the trade-off is not just over the short-run output margin, but also the long-run trend. And still what the paper does with respect to the fiscal policy margin. So as I said before, typically fiscal policy is based on models with exogenous technology in which TFP is just a black box. But now we know more and more from both empirics and also previous modeling work that there is actually a role for the departure from the strict technology and exogenous technology assumption, and instead to incorporate elements from endogenous growth theory in this environment. And then if you think of the cycle trend interaction, which I just showed, there's a reason to assume that aggregate demand to some extent also affects long-run aggregate supply, but we don't know much about the mechanisms and the scope of fiscal policy in this environment, which means that we need novel alternative fiscal tools in this setting. And to just quickly summarize the main result of the paper as to the fiscal side. So the main takeaway is that fiscal policy has long-term effects in this setting under endogenous trend growth, and that the type of fiscal policy tool is decisive for the sign and the magnitude of the fiscal multipliers underlying this model. And the key results is, first of all, you have generally a reduced government spending multiplier, at least with respect to the very long run, because crowding out effects will, over time, not only crowd out physical capital investment, but also investment in R&D and technology adoption, and through that basically weigh on the longer trend output trajectory. But in addition, studying growth policies as a novel fiscal policy tool and novel stabilization tool, because usually we know it from the endogenous growth theory, but this is more a transitory stabilization tool in this setting. And think about fiscal support to R&D, think about fiscal support to firms' technology adoption efforts. And those tools have the advantage that they support aggregate demand and simultaneously lead to an expansion of the long-run trend. Importantly, especially the R&D multiplier can be large and can be larger than 1. Also, this is the key benchmark which we typically care about. And at the same time, while the trend multiplier is typically 0 in the standard DSGE model, because we do not allow for long-run trend effects by assumption, it's positive in the setting because fiscal support to R&D can lead to a permanent expansion in the trend path, and or also fiscal support to technology diffusion activities also has permanent positive trend effects. And importantly, also linking it to the discussion on supply shocks, linking it to the discussion on trade-offs that macroeconomic policy faces in this environment. Because in this setting, those policies are disinflationary in the sense that they exert downward pressure on inflation because they boost TFP, and through the marginal cost channels of firms, they can actually keep inflation down while at the same time providing a boost to output over both the short and the long run, and hence also help to resolve this challenge that monetary policy faces under adverse supply shocks. Now, and because of long-run non-neutrality in this setting, there's also an increased role for monetary fiscal interaction in this setting, but I won't have time to discuss this in further detail here. But just to outline it basically really quickly by means of this chart. So here you see a fiscal support to R&D, you see a fiscal support to technology adoption activities, R&D in blue, adoption in red. And what you see here is that you see an expansion in R&D expenditures, an expansion in adoption, which leads to permanent increases in TFP, where the multiplier of R&D activities is particularly big because they directly go into the frontier and into the technological frontier, and through that also boost our future possibilities for technology adoption. And as a result, they lead to a persistent, a permanent increase in aggregate output and basically permanently higher long-run output path in this setting. And as you see also here, like these fiscal policies are disinflationary and could, for instance, be particularly counteracting inflationary, but contractionary supply shocks, for instance. And yeah, so I will not have time to talk through the fiscal multipliers anymore. I guess it's time to conclude. But again, you see here the negative government spending multiplier, but a short run and medium run boost from government spending, but a permanent negative trend effect. And then R&D and technology adoption growth policies are more slowly moving, but build up to quite substantial long run effects over time, leading to permanent increase in the trend component in R&D, which is about double as large as in the technology adoption multiplier. But then I'm thinking of the current juncture, it may be important to maybe engage in a combination of these policies, because R&D is very long-run oriented, whereas technology adoption activities can basically reap the benefits of earlier innovations very quickly in this sense. So this is the main points of this paper. So let me conclude. So in general, from the viewpoint of models with endogenous trend growth, there's the possibility and also underlying mechanisms of hysteresis and TFP, because typically the standard frameworks cannot capture those. And ignoring hysteresis induces biased estimates of potential output, as well as the resultingly the output gap. So we may get biased signals of slack in this environment. And then as to the question of hysteresis and supply shocks, so we have a trade-off between inflation and output stabilization, which stretches out from the short run to the very long run also to some extent in the setting. And fiscal growth policies are novel and a powerful tool also in the DSGE setting, as they work to demand to stabilize short-run aggregate demand, while at the same time achieve an expansion in the long-run trend, and they can reduce scarring effects also in supply-driven recessions, whereas government spending is inflationary and subject to long-run crowding out. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Michaela. And let me thank the 4 speakers for their super interesting presentation and also for being excellent in terms of time management. So while I wait for more questions from the audience to appear in the chat, perhaps I could start by just try to summarize a few questions that we already received. And those are questions, if I'm not mistaken, all related to Katalin's presentation. So the first question from Professor Orphanidis in the audience is the following: why is 2020 estimate for potential output growth positive? That's not credible given the policy response to COVID. That's the first question. Then we have a question from Michaela, actually, about the presentation, about Katalin's presentation. So I will try to summarize it, but Michaela, feel free to jump in if I'm not correct. The first question is actually related to something I wanted to ask you, so maybe I can just elaborate a bit. So the first question has to do with the method. In the presence of scarring effects, if you apply, for instance, an HP filter approach, this is likely to interpret transitory crisis-induced slowdowns in TFP as a permanent shift in the long-run trend. I guess this is, but again, correct me if I'm wrong, related to just the very nature of those filters that tend to impose irregular sort of shape to business cycles. So whenever you see something larger than usual or more prolonged than usual, you tend to attribute this to the long run, and as opposed to just the crisis itself. And if that's the case, then how do you account for such a permanent shift and for the potential bias, the possible bias on potential output estimates? And related to this, I think the second part of the question, again by Michaela, is about the disentangling, or the difficulty of disentangling sectoral shifts in the context of the COVID episode. That is, you have movements between services and goods, as we have seen from many of the presentations actually, and how do you disentangle this with the overlaid structural or long-run shifts from high productivity good producing industries to low productivity services, which is going to imply some reallocation of resources. So the related question is, how do you disentangle these two effects? So in a way, I guess it's again in a different way, but it's again a story of disentangling short-run versus like transitory, although persistent, from permanent effects. So these are the first 2 questions, but Michaela, feel free to add anything if you want.
Thank you very much. In the first part of the question, I more had in mind like this Gorodnichenko, Olate, and Corbio paper, that if you have a very persistent shock, also relatedly to what we discussed earlier. So if you have a very persistent shock, you might falsely attribute it to permanent, even though it may be possible to revert over time. And in the second part with the sector reallocation, I was more thinking of the structural change, which we see all the time, like from high productivity goods to low productivity services, and how this can be disentangled from the transitory short-lived shock in the context of the pandemic. But thanks.
So please, Katalin, you can reply, and then we'll have a few more. Well, I personally have a few more questions for the other speakers, so we'll have time for that. Please, Katalin.
Okay, thank you very much for the feedback. It's very nice to have questions to our project. So I would like to start with the questions of Michaela, maybe. So I think that our method is, of course, it has its drawbacks, but what we try to achieve is to keep these pre-pandemic long-term trends as far as we thought they were still valid after the pandemic. So this is why we had different counterfactual scenarios for the different sectors. So the level of trend output growth was still very different after the pandemic, and we didn't cancel these long-term processes there. And as far as the use of HP filter and the transitory and permanent factors are affected. So there, we only use the HP filter for the past, for the pre-pandemic period. And after the pandemic, we don't rely on it anymore, exactly because we don't want it to attribute most of the shock to the trend. We were aware that the shock was partially transitory, and we didn't want it to affect the trend. So this is why we used, instead of an HP filter, a B bar, and then used the shock, the estimated supply shock, and calculated the part of this supply shock that could have affected the trend. So I hope that this clarifies. And as far as why is 2021 potential output growth positive? Yeah, so this is a very good question. But in fact, there were some sectors which were not shut down or locked down in the pandemic. There was even a sector which probably benefited, even if not in 21, then beyond. So there were some sectors where we estimate negative growth, but not in the entire economy as a whole. And this is also not the case for the other estimates of potential output. So European Commission also has a positive but more moderate potential output growth than before the pandemic, or than what was expected before the pandemic.
Great, thanks, Katalin. So we have another question from the chat from Martin Large. That's about Michaela's presentation. Michaela, in light of what you said, I'm just reading here, how would you assess policy implication of the Commission's, the European Commission, I believe, practice observed after 2019 in their forecast to assume that output would return to a linear pre-crisis trend? And if I may, can I just add a question? That is not really related to that, but since you've shown very quickly in the end of the presentation some fiscal multipliers, one thing that you can do with your model, which is a structural and forward-looking model, is you can factor in the effects of policy decisions, which are almost, I mean, they're in the making, or they're just in a very early stage now, such as NGU and so on. And the question is whether you have tried to just gauge a few numbers out of your model. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions. I'm working my way in the reverse order because I have a question. Like, you mean like to give additional numbers on the fiscal multipliers, or I didn't quite understand partially.
No. My point was just given the numbers you obtained, if you just have a sense of what type of effects we should expect overall from the, if that's possible with your model.
Okay, like from a specific, from the specific program you had in mind. Yeah, so in general, the plan for the paper is to relate it a bit with some actual like fiscal policy measures which have been put into place, which go into this direction a bit more, because I mean, we're used to talk about like government spending a lot, but we're not so familiar with these type of fiscal policy tools, even though they've partially been also implemented also across countries. So this would be more nice, very nice to actually add this here. So this is currently a bit in the making still, to also add something directly empirical to it as well. And yeah, I hope that answers your question. Okay, and then to the question on the potential output estimates. Well, so this views are strictly my own here, right? Like that I'm presenting. It's I'm not really here to comment other policy institutions' assessment of potential output or the output gap. But in general, I mean, the implications from this line of work is that you can have permanent effects on trend. You can have permanent effects in terms of your longer output trajectory, but whether or not like this shock falls in this category is not something that I'm willing to comment here now in this, or not. That's not my role also here in this setting. Thanks.
All right, thanks. So we still have time for a few more questions, but In the meanwhile, I'll have a couple of questions. The first one is for Deniz. You shown these patterns about historical movements in debt levels, which I presume were aggregate private and public debt, but that's part of the first part of the question. And you related this to growth and inflation, and in a sense also interest rates. So my question is, have you tried and sort of look at more disaggregated level data? Because of the following reason. So in the past few years, especially, we have seen a prolonged period of low rates almost worldwide. And so the question about whether those debt levels, which again, I assume are aggregated level, is about how sustainable these are, which is related, of course, to the evolution of growth, but also to the evolution of interest rates. So did you try and look more closely at disaggregated country groups and so on? So is there anything we can learn from just looking at groups of countries in terms of similar levels of productivity growth and so on?
That's a great question. First, yeah, for clarity, it's in the figure that I showed, it combines private and public. But if you were to split them, you do see a pretty consistent pattern. This is growing both in the public sector and the private sector over the years. It has accumulated. When you split the private sector among households and non-financial, there's a little bit of variation across countries and enduring periods, but the general pattern, I'll say, is there. Now, our interpretation and the motivation of bringing it there was this idea of, what is driving growth. And in the past, meaning in the 60s, 70s, you had the structural reforms, the liberalization, globalization, new technologies being introduced, and productivity responding to that. And as a result of that, fiscal and monetary policy could get by doing little, right? So you're on a growth path. That was the idea. But as those trends started to slow down, and in certain times when they started to reverse, fiscal and monetary policy needed to do much more. And that shows up as part of public debt, obviously, when fiscal has to interfere, but also in private debt, because as monetary policy pushes interest rates lower and lower, making credit cheaper, and private agents load up on that, and you do get the temporary push up in inflation and in growth, and hopefully there are some longer term impacts on that too, but not necessarily. And that's the point we're making there. So to summarize, I would say the level of interest rates is part of the picture, but it's not the only one. And it's more of an endogenous effect, if you would. On going more granular, these are all aggregate. We do have some machinery that looks at by sector, as well as the distribution of debt across different households in terms of the income deciles. So we can do some more there, and but not at the level that probably you have in mind.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. So
Alessandro, do we
yep,
still have time?
Sure.
If there are no, okay, so
there's two questions in the chat which you can ask Michaela later, but okay, we have time. Yes, please go ahead.
So thanks a lot for I think very interesting presentations. I think they all highlight this possibility of scarring. I have a question for David. I think in his presentation he emphasized the fact that these kind of permanent effects are conditional on very much on the size of the shock and also the direction of the shock. Now I know it's an empirical paper, but it would be interesting to hear whether you have thought about sort of specific mechanisms which lead these large shocks to more permanent effects. It could be skills, or it could be destruction of capital or something like this. That would be interesting to hear your views on that. And the second one, maybe more generally, this scarring, then how does it square, in your view, after the COVID, say, with the fact that we have unusually strong labor markets? So I don't know, Katrin or Deniz, if you want to comment on that. Thank you.
take the first one. Thank you very much, Juha, for that really nice question. So I can't give you a great answer because as you said, it's an empirical paper. So it would be speculative, I think, what I'd say. I mean, the first point I'd make is we've had trouble matching the stylized facts that we're developing in our paper with the literature on endogenous growth and on financial frictions, because I think they don't quite fit with any of the stories that I've seen out there. So they're related to what Michaela was talking about in terms of demand shocks having the potential to cause permanent effects. You know, we see that. We see, you know, monetary policy induced recessions having these very long-lasting effects. But our results are, because they're kind of one-sided, that's not consistent with the endogenous growth literature, I'd say. So it does suggest, in my mind, you know, we need a model that's combining endogenous growth with some kind of occasionally binding constraints or something like that on to give you the negative effects. But I think that's the best I can say. It's a really good question, but I don't have that model. Thank you.
Thank you, David. While we wait for more questions, I will just read a few more that we received for Michaela. The first one is, if I interpret it correctly, is about the symmetric nature of the results in your model, meaning that booms can lead to permanent effects just as much as drops. And the second one is, does that apply to each and every recession? Does that mean that each recession is going to have permanent lower, well, yes, in that case, lower is going to lead to lower TFP growth. And the second question for Michaela again, I guess, yes, is about structural deceleration of TFP growth. It's quite a long question, but I'll try to summarize it. So for the sake of argument, when the technology lemon is just increasingly squeezed, would then recessions be just triggers rather than causes of lower TFP? And so it's probably just about redefining the term scarring. And if indeed if there were such structural causes for a deceleration of productivity growth at work, then couldn't DSG models lead to misleading results? That's the long question.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the questions. I'll start with the first one, and then I have some clarifications on the last one. I'm not sure if I completely followed. So in general, you have to think every shock which occurs in this model against the backdrop of what macroeconomic stabilization does. So for instance, if we can show in this type of frameworks, if we have a monetary authority which assumes responsibility for the trend margin, or if we have a fiscal policy which assumes responsibility for the trend margin, we will not see scoring effects. We will revert to our initial trend path, but I guess this type of policies would look very different to the ones we have currently in place. That's the answer for the first part of the question. So, I mean, in principle, every shock in every deep recession in the absence of support policies from the macroeconomic side, we would result in scoring, but it cannot be generalized in that way. It also depends in general, I guess, on the nature of the shock and the interplay with monetary and fiscal in this setting. As to the question of symmetry, I think the jury is still out on that one. If we see a asymmetric or a symmetric response, first of all, because we haven't seen that many expansions, at least in the last couple of years, which you could basically also compare over time in that respect. And also we would need more evidence based on time series and microdata, which look more thoroughly in this question, I think, and generally to really rule this out on a more broader scale. But in general, like this model is asymmetric in the sense because it has an occasionally binding constraint. So in a sense, you would see an asymmetric response, at least like if you simulate across all of the shocks, you would still see that booms lead to less persistent drops, less strong increases than the recessions would do, but it's not absent, so it's not zero, and a boom would result in higher productivity growth. And also, I guess the question was about growth. The model is not about permanently lower growth. The model is about transitorily slower growth, and a reversion to the initial growth rates after time, inducing a permanent level shift. So I'm talking about scoring in terms of the level, not in terms of the growth rates, because there you would need a very different type of environment to generate that. Then about the last part of the question, I'm not entirely sure if I got it right, but let me see. So right, in this framework, for instance, in our work for the euro area, we also disentangle structural factors from such as that ideas are getting harder to find, thinking of the work by Van Renen and Bloom on the efficiency of R&D over time. So this is there to take care of these longer run structural trends in productivity growth. So, and for that, we see, for instance, for the euro area that before 2008, it was predominantly the longer run structural changes which weighed on TFP growth, and then you have a separate role for the crisis-induced movement as of 2008, and so you can basically disentangle this type of shocks and from using this model. I don't know. And I don't know if this question goes in the direction that it's desirable to have some scoring, but I'm not sure if I interpreted it correctly.
Thanks, Michaela. I'm not sure either, but perhaps we can give the floor to Katalin, who wanted to just add a little bit on her answer to Juha's question. So, Katalin, you have 2-3 more minutes.
Yeah, thank you very much. So you have asked how to reconcile this scaling with very strong labor markets. So from our perspective, we first of all, I would like to mention 2 factors. So one is that in our estimations, most of the scaling would have come from capital and TFP, and somewhat less from labor. And the other factor that I would like to mention is that we prepared this analysis in 2021, and since then things changed somewhat. So maybe our estimates would change, no? But we didn't update. And in 2021, it seemed like both labor force participation rate and migration in particular were negatively affected by the pandemic. Since then, this both changed. So this is not true anymore, but this is why we had a negative contribution. And also we took into consideration already that there was expected a downward trend in labor contribution before the pandemic. So this is my answer for the question. Thank you.
Okay, we have Deniz. Did you want to?
Just one minute thing there.
Sure.
I think it's a very interesting part of what's going on. So thanks for the question, Juha. We did one thing, which was a decomposition of total hours in various countries, and some interesting patterns come out of that. One is US and to some extent UK is quite different, behaving quite different from other countries in the sense that labor force participation rate seems to explain both much of the recovery, but also why we're still below trend, right? And that's why when I showed the beverage curves, I was referring to maybe there's an adverse supply shock in labor markets in those countries that we need to be aware of, and what comes next. Now, there's also this quite interesting, I'm saying, if labor markets are so tight, why aren't we seeing even stronger wage growth? That's kind of the puzzle for us. And talking to some labor market experts, one storyline we've been hearing is that it's not wages as much people ask for, it's the flexibility, the amenities, right? You don't want to work the graveyard shift, even if it pays the same money, or if it offers more, you're just not going to take it. It's not worth it. Or the telework that was discussed a lot, but also some other things that may not be related to telework, but other type of flexible hours, choice of your hours, or just having a better boss. People realize maybe life has different meanings and hours work are not there. So these are all, part of the pandemic shock that we're going through, and until the whole thing falls in place, it's going to be very difficult to say. But I do agree we need much more work, much more thinking on that ground.
Thank you, Deniz. Okay, so we'll we come to the end of the first session. Let me thank all the presenters for their excellent job, and see you soon. Thank you.
So welcome back to everyone. After a great first session, we're going to dig a bit deeper into the tools and how to measure the output gap actually in times of large shocks. So the first speaker will be Fabio Canova from the Norwegian Business School.
Thanks for asking me to talk. So this is a paper I've written. You can find the actual text on my homepage. So let me tell you more or less what is the motivation for this paper. Well, I don't think there is much to explain to this crowd that a lot of latent variables are very much of interest in both policy and academics. I'm talking about the distinction between potential and gap, or star variable like natural rate of unemployment or R star and things like this. The problem is that there's a lot of differences in the definition that people use, and this is probably due to the fact that there are many definitions in the literature. So I took few of them that I found from the previous literature. So, for example, Ocon defines potential as a maximum level of production consistent with full employment that doesn't trigger inflationary pressure above what is socially desirable, price stability and free markets. So this is obviously not very operational definition. Kuttner defines this as the maximum production potential, as the maximum production generating at least constant inflation. So we know how we could implement this. Friedman many years ago had a model which has become known as the plucking model, in which basically long-run consideration are driven by supply. So the potential is driven by supply, and business cycle or gaps are cyclical contraction from these long-run paths, and they're only driven by demand shocks. So there is no excess demand doesn't exist here. However, the most common definition that you can find in the last few years basically comes from the New Keynesian work that Mike Woodford has developed 20 years ago, and in which the potential is defined as the counterfactual path of the variable once you eliminate nominal friction and monetary shocks. So if you take this as your definition of what potential and gap, obviously, is the difference between actual level of output and this potential, counterfactual potential, then you can see immediately that gaps are meaningful object only in terms of a particular model, particular New Keynesian model with particular frictions and particular shocks. So when it comes to measurement, we are in trouble with this kind of definition for the simple reason that there are many models which are used in different institutions, and some, for example, have real friction, some have real friction and financial friction, some have capacity constraints and things of that type. And the only exercise that I've known, which is run in this paper by Furlanetto, which compares 3 of these models, basically get very different property for the path, for the gaps, depending on basically what you put in these models. Which means basically misspecification might be important, shortcuts may be important. So most of the people basically revert to statistical tools as a way of making robust estimates or obtain robust measures of these latent variables, which are less prone to misspecification and much easier to produce on a regular basis when is needed for policy questions. So basically, what this paper investigates is, how do standard measures of gap or extracted with standard statistical tool. I'm thinking about here Hodrick and Prescott filter or bandpass filters or Blanchard and Poix decomposition. How do they relate to gaps produced in a New Keynesian DSG model? If we look at different statistics, is there any approach which minimizes basically the distortion that is uniformly superior to all the others? Is there any better way of doing what we can do with these statistical approaches? And in general, the question is, can we use these statistical estimates to guide the researcher when we ask policy questions? So the main points are not very positive on this paper. Well, basically, the idea is that in the theory, new Keynesian theory, there are a lot of restrictions which are not satisfied by the assumption of the statistical approach. In particular, in the theory, potential need not to be trending in the sense of having a unit root. So the composition in trend and cycle, in which the trend as unit root and the cycle is stationary, may not be sensitive, sensible. Same thing, the potential may have a permanent and transitory fluctuation. So again, the permanent and transitory decomposition may not be the right thing. And more importantly, these potential have quite a lot of variability at business cycle frequency, and correspondingly gap have quite a lot of variation in the low frequency, which means that any decomposition which basically use the standard assumption will mix them up. And one other important thing is that gap and potential tend to be correlated because they are driven by the same shock, and they tend to have a similar variance decomposition by frequency. So I will very briefly mention that obviously, given that the statistical approach uses assumptions which are inconsistent with the logic of the models, we ended up having a lot of mistakes. And what the paper does, it presents a class of filter which are called Butterworth filters, which can adapt to basically these assumptions which are in the theory. So very quick illustration, I took the three-equation model of Jordi-Galli, I solved it, you can find it in the book, and basically the solution for the output gap and the output potential are given by equation 5 and 6. So it's very difficult in 3 seconds to digest things, but let me notice that AT, which is a technology shock, enter both in the potential and which is YN, and in the gap, which is YT star. Okay, so unless these shocks are really dominating, these other demand shocks are dominating, these two components are going to be correlated. That's the first thing. Second thing, the persistence of these two latent components will be driven primarily by the persistence of AT, which is typically larger than the persistence of VT, which again, it means that these two will have very similar persistence. And as long as the variability of the demand shock is not an order of magnitude larger than the variability of this technology shock, we'll have a frequency distribution of the variance, which is similar across representation. So here is the summary of what I just said. And the thing I want to emphasize that this problem is not simply a question of output potential and output gap, is also a problem with any latent variable decomposition. So if I'm interested in the natural rate of interest and I have a nominal interest rate as an observable variable, then the gap, the interest rate gap, and the potential will have the same feature. I want to make sure that there are no misunderstanding here. This is a very simple model. It's only 3 shocks, but I can show you very easily that a model in which I have many more shocks, the same intuition will hold. And for illustration, I just took this Matt and Walter model. I simulate the output gap and the output potential of that model using the mode estimates that you obtain, that Matt and Walter they obtain. And these are the time paths of the two variables. So as you can see, the correlation between the two is pretty high, by 0.8. Each of them has persistence, which is very high, and they have obviously very similar distribution of variance and variability in general. And you can see this also if you like to show spectral shape. So this is the spectral shape of the gap, the red one, and the spectral shape of the potential. They look the same. Okay? So obviously, the statistical methods do not use these assumptions. In particular, they assume that the two latent components are uncorrelated, that the persistence of the potential is larger than the persistence of gap, or that the potential is located at the difference frequency of the spectrum. So there's going to be a large mismatch between the two, which means basically we're going to make large mistakes in general. So the next part of the paper, apart from these simple illustrations, basically runs a Monte Carlo exercise, a horse race, in which I generate gaps and potentials from many models, many new Keynesian models with free friction of all sorts and without. And it turns out that, very surprisingly, the simplest possible procedure, which is simply a polynomial detrending, is going to be the least distorting filter, and basically because it doesn't change the ups and downs of the true gaps as the other approaches do. And again, for illustration, let me just move here. So the gap is one simulation of the gap is the red path, and what the polynomial detrending does is basically the blue path. So as you can see, the ups and downs are the same. There is a little bit more variability, especially in the ups and the downs, but overall the turning points are recognized with correctly. If instead I'm interested in extracting, rather than the gap and potential, the permanent and the transitory component of the observable variable, then it turns out that taking again a very simple filter, which is simply differencing, and here it could be either short differencing, like 1 period, or medium term differencing, could be 4 or 8 period, or is going to be the least distorting. But as you can see, again, the polynomial, the trending approach seems to be very close competitors. So it looks like, among all the tools, I have to mention that I've tried 15 different decompositions, and from the very simple one that I mentioned here to very fancy one, like, for example, an observable component. I use wavelet filters. I use Blanchard and Qua, Beveridge and Nelson, an observable component. So anything which is basically available in the literature. And just to compare, so this is what the polynomial extract out of the data, and this is what the Blanchard and Qua, for example, decomposition extract from the data. This is the red line. So as you can see, the match is way, way far off. And if I use the Beveridge and Nelson, again, the match is completely off. There's a lot of low frequency variation, which are not really in the true gap. Okay, so the question is, I told you that the polynomial detrending and the first order differencing are basically, the best, but that doesn't mean that they are among the class of filter I consider, but that doesn't mean that they are not distorting. They are obviously distorting. If I'm interested in measuring variability of the gap, obviously this is not going to be perfect, and there are other statistics which I'm not matching very well. So the question is there any, if I don't want to go to a model, I want to keep staying within a statistical approach, is there an approach which can do this? And the answer is yes. So there is this class of filter which engineering do. So for example, this is what is built into your phone, which basically are moving ARMA type of filters, which depend on 3 parameters, and depending on the parameter, they can have any spectral shape as you like. As you can see here, they can look like bandpass filter, they can look like a high pass filter or low pass filters. So it turns out that if you take this black line here as your favorite bandpass filter, you can do very well. So here is an example of, again, simulated time series of the gaps in red, and what you in blue, what you would get out of a univariate Butterworth filter. The first one is for output, the second one is consumption, the third one is investment, etc. So you have a bunch of variables here, and it looks like you're doing pretty well in terms of visual aspects. And you do also very well in terms of practical aspects. So if you, in many new Keynesian models, for example, when you estimate the Phillips curve, you substitute output gap for the labor share. So the labor share is highly correlated in a new Keynesian model with the gap. So since you can measure the labor share, you can ask which filter is basically able to reproduce better the time series property of the labor share. And as you can see down here, the Butterworth filter seems to be the best in terms of root mean square error at business cycle frequency, correlation with the true component, correlation at business cycle frequency, and although is not comparable, also in terms of persistence and variability. So this class of filter seems to be superior to all the other ones which are used in the literature, and primarily because they respect some of the assumptions. So it doesn't require the component to be uncorrelated. It doesn't require the component to have a particular location in the frequency domain, and it doesn't require component to be of different persistence. And you can see this if you know what I'm talking about by the fact that the gain function of this filter is roughly constant across frequency. So I'm going to stop here.
Fabio, thank you very much. Let's move to the next presentation by David Sonderman of the ECB on the state of current work in the Eurosystem on measuring APOGAP. There you go.
Thanks so much for the invitation. It's really a great honor to be here. It's quite an intimidating panel with all these experts around, like Fabio, and then also of the last panel. Unfortunately, I came a bit late, but I heard some of the discussion still. So the good thing is that many of my colleagues working on supply side issues in the ECB are with me here, like Bela and Katalin, who presented earlier, and Julien. So I can refer all the questions that you might have then to them. Okay, no, on a more serious note, what I'm planning to use the time for today is to sort of review a bit what we've done since 2020, sort of when the series of shocks that hit the euro economy and the global economy started. So, of course, what we did is to review conceptually the approaches towards potential output measurement quite clearly, because this was a series of shocks that we didn't see in that form before since the onset of the euro area, since the creation of the euro area in 1999. What we also did, obviously, is to adapt our own models to this shock. So we use one model, the unobserved component model of Martin Todt 2021, that we, for example, had to adapt, just as one example, where my colleague Julien then worked to adapt it to the shock, be it by working with dummies to take control of the shock through dumbing them out, or work with changing the shock volatility, so sort of addressing specifically the covariance matrices to account for the shock following Lenza and Primiceri that you probably know. So that's, of course, work that we did to sort of make those models fit for the shock at hand. But then also, and that you saw in the last session, we started to develop some new approaches that were trying to address the shock at hand, right? So we've clearly seen with the COVID shock that potential output measures that usually capture the overall economy were not always sort of helping if you have a very a shock that hits sectors very heterogeneously, like the COVID shock, right? So we started to work on those sectoral approaches that Katalin presented. So what I'm trying to do today is basically discuss those conceptual reviews, adaptations along the three type of challenges that but are somehow related to each other. So in the case of the COVID pandemic, then the energy shock and the supply chain constraints, which obviously are partly emerging from the COVID pandemic, and the question to what extent we see some divergence between output gap measures and unemployment gap measures. And I have to apologize in advance because I missed part of the first session. So if I repeat something that you already discussed, my apologies for that. So let me first tell you a bit how, in case you don't know yet, we do a potential output estimates in the Eurosystem. Most notably, the real experts are, aside of a few colleagues here in the division, are in the NCBs. And also there's a strong collaboration between the national central banks and the ECB on that matter. We collaborate quite closely throughout the year, throughout the various projections, iterations. And of course, we look at a suite of models, right? So this is true for the individual NCBs. This is true for us here at the ECB. And this helps us to sort of cross-check our views on potential. And then we have a significant amount of horizontal discussions, both with the NCBs, but also between our supply side experts, the country desks, to sort of ensure that we have a proper understanding of how much, in this case, a certain shock impacts the supply side and how this is finding its way into the projection estimates, right? But we also have quite a lot of regular interaction with the other international institutions, in particular on the EU level, on the output gap working group. I've seen also many, I think, experts from that side dialed in for today's meeting. So again, I think they're definitely in the whole call more experts on potential than I am. So I think good for that discussion later in this panel. And since a few years, we also have a structured process, which is called the annual supply side review, where we take stock of latest developments affecting the supply side of the economy, right? So it's both meant to discuss those overall developments and how conceptually they impact potential output. And as you know yourself, quite a lot has has happened there over the last couple of years. But it's also meant to review country estimates of the NCBs, of the ECB, and have those discussions with the NCBs. Now, a very important point is that those potential output estimates that we use are not published. So as you can imagine, I don't leave you with a lot of blank pages thereafter, but I'm trying to fill this gap, which makes it somehow difficult a bit to talk about our estimates here, by finding some alternative estimates to make the points, bring the points across here. So one option is that I use a range of other institutions or some internal estimates like the UCM I mentioned or the Jaroszynski-Lenza model. But I mean, it's important to understand that these are not to be understood as the Eurosystem's potential output estimates. So let's start with the first sort of shock that happened and sort of the first challenge that we faced, and that was the COVID crisis, of course. And here, what we usually have as a definition is that we see potential output more as a medium-term concept, where any temporary shock should not really affect its growth rate, no? But I mean, we know that also from evidence in the literature that there is some cyclicality of potential output. And we know, of course, that as from a certain moment on, temporary shocks will have a bearing on potential output. But how was this in the COVID case? And colleagues in my division did a very nice bulletin article that I can only recommend to read, where they try to show conceptually to what extent there are different views on how potential was affected or not by those containment measures. And we start here on the left chart, where we basically have two interpretations possible, right? The first interpretation is that we say containment measures, which basically forced firms, because of social distancing and so on and so forth, to either produce less, right, or sort of in terms of services, give less service to the economy, or maybe even prevented business at all, still had those production factors at hand, right? So machines were working in the restaurants, especially because of job retention schemes. People were still on the payroll, ready to work anytime. So you could basically say potential was not affected at all. So everything goes in the output gap, right? So that's basically here the blue on both charts, sorry, the blue interpretation, right? So potential not affected, everything goes into the output gap. A second way of interpreting these COVID containment measures is to say, de facto, those production factors were not available to businesses, right? So a loss in potential, and if you see this to the extreme, everything goes into potential, so that for the output gap, you hardly have any impact, right? And that's sort of the two views that prevailed, right? Now, I mean, when we reviewed us, I heard that Katalin's paper now, and she made very clear now what I show you here conceptually, how we now probably know that after with benefit of the hindsight, COVID impacted potential. This is something that evolved. No, we didn't have this view that I depict here now in the first year, but now with the benefit of the hindsight, we know a bit more what of the sort of views probably prevailed, right? And overall, we probably see that potential was relatively little impacted, right? So on the labor side, we've seen that migration was only temporarily affected. On mortality, it's mainly impacting, or has been mainly impacting, the non-working age population. And we saw that labor force participation over in the end, and I think Deniz made the point as well, for the euro area is even significantly above than what we see in other jurisdictions. So no scarring to the extent we can see, probably to the extent, to a large extent because of job retention schemes, no real scarring on the labor side. On the capital side, probably some weaker investment growth, but on the capital stock, where we probably would have affected, there was firm closure. There's some parts that affect the capital stock. That of course didn't happen as well, no? Because here again, policy measures help to uphold, keep firms afloat, so that the capital stock was also really not much affected. On productivity, even some upsides. If you look at digitalization, probably that helped to sort of increase productivity, that made the economy more resilient because we could many at least tailor work. The only downside probably was coming from the supply chain disruptions, and there's also something that we will then in the next shock sort of see to what extent that maybe has indeed permanently disrupted a bit productivity growth, because here firms for sure had only a limited capacity to produce and transfer technology. And the question here really is that going into trend TFP growth or not? But overall, if I look at sort of measures of potential output, and as I said, we don't depict the ECB's estimate here, but what we try to show is a range of institutional estimates here in blue and some in-house models in red, in the red range, if you wish, right? And if you look at the blue range, you can see that there's quite especially in 2020, quite a strong divergence, at least for a short amount of time. And I think this is basically depicting what I tried to say earlier, where some institutions, like the IMF on the one hand, probably said potential was affected by the containment measures. So less was going into the output gap, and therefore the output gap being, those estimates of the output gap probably being to the upper side here. And other estimates, I think more probably the Commission side, that then saw potential was not affected that much, and most of the shock went into the output gap. Now, let's move to a second sort of challenge for measuring potential output, and that is emerging from the at least in many approaches, from the notion that we want to define potential output as the level of output that does not create inflationary, disinflationary pressures, if you wish, compared to a trend or target or what in a medium term. Many institutions don't have that link to inflation, have more production function bottom-up approach, looking at the various factors of production. But if you want to sort of link it to inflation, the question that we have in the current juncture is, what do you do when you have a shock that affects growth and inflation maybe somewhat differently, such as the energy price shock or the supply chain disruption, right? So again, I mean, if you look at some of the institutional, a range of institutional estimates that maybe at the current juncture see the output gap still negative, but at the same time, I mean, from those estimates, you would probably judge that inflationary pressures should be relatively low. But then, of course, we have a range of measures of underlying inflation that we usually look at on the right-hand side here. And already at the beginning of 22 and then increasing since then, we saw quite some inflationary buffers, quite inflationary pressures building up here, right? So how to reconcile the two? And one way of looking at it is indeed that you say, look at models that have a more prominent role of inflation, like the UCM linking the detrending and trending of variables to some economic relation, like such as the Phillips curves, where you also link output to inflation, where if you look at the range of those models, you see a bit of a higher output gap. So more of the shock goes into potential output, right? Again, I mean, taking one step back, how conceptually would we think that potential is affected, can be affected, to really understand whether we see potential as being affected by those type of shocks or not? And I think when you take the energy price shock, we think it's probably mainly affecting corporate production costs. And of course, if it stays for a longer time, then this is more of a permanent shock. We thought to look at a bit at military spending, because that was, of course, especially sometimes during 2022, seemed to be an important part of additional sort of upward pressures on potential through the capital channel, but we didn't find very conclusive evidence there yet. I guess probably the most important point, in addition to these corporate production costs, is the fact to what extent maybe productivity has been impacted more by these relocalization, deglobalization trends that we think probably have started to emerge with the unjustified war of Russia in Ukraine, where maybe there are some reasons to believe that really trend TFP has been affected more, and therefore maybe we think that also potential along the lines could have been lower than we see in some of the models, and that then probably fits better to sort of more inflationary pressure coming up. No, and that is probably also this is probably also what we've seen at least partly in 2022 when supply was still constrained, and many firms used sort of their pricing power when demand was coming back to increase prices. But another way of looking at that is of course to say maybe potential output and the output gap don't give us the full picture of where, to what extent we see slack or tightness in the economy. And another way of looking at it is maybe to look more into the unemployment gap and seeing whether there are signs of divergence between the two measures. And if you look at the right-hand side here of the unemployment gap estimate, the range of NAIRUs and the unemployment rate, you would probably see that in 2020, we had, according to the output, the unemployment gap rather maybe neither slack or maybe neutral impact from the unemployment gap, with the unemployment gap being in between the range of estimates. At the same time, with a very strong negative output gap. So where there's times of a disconnect, we would probably argue no, because in that case, the unemployment gap was not capturing the full extent of adjustment that is possible in the labor market. So the intensive margin, hours worked, was probably here better reflected in the output gap than in the unemployment gap, because we know that through job retention schemes, firms had the chance to keep on hold to labor, but reduce the average hours those colleagues worked, so that if you adjust the unemployment rate for those job retention schemes, you indeed had quite a positive unemployment gap. So basically the mirror image of the output gap. But at the current juncture, those job retention schemes are basically not relevant anymore. And still, we see probably a relatively tight labor market, whereas for most institutions, they seem to still suggest we have somewhat of slack in the economy. So how is that fitting together? And maybe at that point, we see some more interesting signals coming from the labor market indicators. And I think we discussed this also partly in the last panel. And I think what is important here is to say, indeed, there are a range of margins of labor market adjustment that is not fully captured once again by the unemployment gap. We still have lower average hours worked than we had before this crisis started. So some slack indeed could be still in the market in the economy, if you assume that this is something that needs to revert back. At the same time, we've seen quite an increase, as I said, in the labor force participation rate in population. So quite some argument why indeed higher demand is matched by more labor supply more recently. But I think it's a good the main point I'm trying to make here, in addition to sort of this disconnect that we see partly and why it's necessary to look at other margins of labor market adjustment, is that sometimes it's probably helpful that in addition to these unobservable variables, such as the unemployment gap or the output gap, to broaden the indicators of slack that we can measure and get a more complete picture to really see to what extent we believe there are wage or inflation pressures in the economy. And here I depict, just for the illustrative purposes, some sort of stylized indicators that one usually looks at, like the vacancy to unemployment ratio or labor shortages indicators, that indeed say, in relative terms, we see quite a tight labor market that probably will lead to some wage and inflation pressures. To what extent, we can discuss later still. But, and it's my last point here, also quite some heterogeneity. So whenever we want to judge the inflationary pressure in the economy, let's also be mindful that there are quite some heterogeneous developments, be it across countries. We see here Spain versus Germany, for example, or in regions. No, when we look at different labor shortages indicators across regions, also there we can't really say, not even in the current times, that the tightness is the same everywhere. Okay, I'll close here with my last slide, basically saying that we continue to work on this issue, fine-tuning our estimates on potential output, the output gap, NAIRU estimates. We have a dedicated expert group on productivity, where we try to see to what extent those past shocks and trends impact productivity. And of course, There are also other shocks that I didn't mention yet, such as climate change, that actually we're going to look at in more detail, such as the physical risk and the impact on potential output in the next couple of months and quarters. So I stop here, and apologies for running over a bit.
Thank you, David. So let's move to the next presentation by Matthias Strifler from the National Audit Office of Finland.
Thank you. So while Dragana is putting up the slides, let me quickly say thank you to the organizers to have us today here. So we are coming more kind of from the fiscal policy side. I'm from the fiscal policy monitoring function, and this paper is co-authored with my esteemed colleague Arto Kokkinen. So what you're going to see now is maybe a little bit more radical with regard to measuring or trying to measure the business cycle. So we developed a business cycle heat map for the European Union, the Euro area, and all of the member states. So on the next slide, you can see that output, or we know that output gap estimates have been revising heavily lately, which has made work quite difficult for us, kind of communicating to the fiscal policymakers whether the fiscal stance is now expansive or not. Well, the key issue in the output gap methodology is that you first have to estimate an unobserved trend. But real time, this is impossible, as you know, because the trend revises with new statistical observations for the current and the next couple of years. So what we tried to come up with was a way to directly measure the business cycle position, and without having to deal with an ongoing revising of the output gap. So some independent fiscal institutions and also some central banks, they already use business cycle heat maps, often based on annual data, and quite often they rely on domestic data. So what we try to come up with was a heat map for EU members using harmonized data for all the member states. We try to measure the output gap or the cycle in a direct way, almost real time, and having kind of close to no revisions. And kind of the idea was to get an alternative to especially the Commission's output gap estimates. And since we kind of are from a small open economy, here the revising was even more, or maybe is even more heavily pronounced than in the larger economies. So on the next slide, you can see that we try to choose our heat map indicators reflecting the in a way that they reflect the development in GDP or potential output. So there we kind of move a little bit in between the growth cycle and the growth rate cycle. There are monthly or quarterly observations available for all the EU member states. The data is comparable, and we modified or chose the data in a way that it enters in that it is stationary in the heat map. Then we are able to calculate a composite indicator as a weighted average from all of these indicators, and then using, for example, the standard deviation and the average of output gaps, which are calculated using only historical data, where at the end the kind of problems of the symmetric filter kind of don't play a role. If you kind of don't use the latest 2 or 3 years, then you can also, in a sense, scale and shift this composite indicator in a way that you, for example, can use the semi-elasticities calculated by the OECD to calculate the fiscal stance, for example. So on the next slide, we have the first set of indicators, which are kind of describing the real economy. So we have the harmonized consumer price index on a year-on-year basis, the employment rate combined with actual hours worked. So here we had the issue that labor force survey measured employment rate didn't that much respond during the COVID crisis. So we kind of had to take into account that many people kind of well, the movement wasn't exactly kind of measured or picked up by the employment rate. So we combined it with the actual hours worked. The same we did so with the unemployment rate, where we also included the absences from work. Then we have also vacancies, and the cross wages and salaries weighted based on the relative size of the industries. So this is the real economy. On the next slide, we have survey-based indicators where we heavily rely on the Commission's economic sentiment indicator, or respectively the respective sub-indicators. So industry confidence, services confidence, consumer confidence, construction confidence, also retail confidence, and the weighing is following the weighing of the economic sentiment indicator, where we have the relative size of the industries taken into account. So on the next slide, you can then see on the next slide, Dragana, please. Yeah, thank you. So here you can see as an example for the EU 27, kind of how the ultimate weighing of the composite indicator kind of can look like. So for the real economy indicators, they are all given the same weight, and they are 0.12 at the end. And then for the survey indicators, we tried, as I said, we tried to follow the weighing of the industry, the relative industry size. And as a total weight, it's then roughly to 0.4. So ultimately, then we get the weighing, which you can see on the right hand side. On the next slide, you can then already see kind of that well, looking now only at the quarterly standardized indicators, not kind of focusing on the composite indicators so far, but only kind of taking a look at the standardized, or the C-score of all of these 10 indicators. You can already see that all 10 of those seem to kind of tell a quite consistent story about the almost the last 2 decades. So on the left-hand side, you can see the GFC, and on the right-hand side more, you can see the effect of the COVID recession. Now, at the very right-hand side in the panel, you can actually see that the inflation, the harmonized consumer price index, is in a sense kind of going through the roof, and kind of moving away from this kind of more consistent pattern before, and at the same time also consumer confidence is nosediving, in a sense as also in a response probably to a large degree due to the development in inflation. But otherwise, kind of disregarding this most recent development, you can see that kind of there is indication that these 10 different kind of C-scores of these variables kind of already kind of at least to a large degree kind of tell us a consistent or a common story about the business cycle phase. Given the weighing I just described, on the next slide, we can then see or kind of calculate this composite indicator out of these 10 single heat map indicators. Now in the background, these gray dotted lines are the single indicators, and the blue solid line is our composite indicator. And now it's kind of straightforward to also calculate a confidence interval for the composite indicator. And well, since the inflation and the consumer confidence are kind of developing in opposite directions, especially in 2022 or ongoing, you can see that then the confidence interval kind of broadens at that point. More closely, you can see that in recessions, for example, the GFC, also during the COVID crisis, the confidence interval broadens. So kind of this gives us already kind of an understanding, an almost real-time understanding kind of the phase of the business cycle. And next we can see how this now compares to, for example, to the Commission's output gap estimates. So if we aggregate to the annual level the data, we can here the blue solid line again is the now shifted and scaled composite indicator with the respective confidence interval, and the black solid line is now the most recent Commission's output gap estimate. So you can see that the Commission's output gap estimate is quite often within, or quite the development is very similar to the heat map composite indicator, and quite often it is actually within the 95% confidence interval. Closer to the GFC, you can see that it is for some time outside of the confidence interval, and then again, for example, in 2021, it is outside of the confidence interval, where now, according to this heat map indicator or the composite indicator, rebounding would have been more strongly than based on the Commission's output gap estimates. So we did this exercise for all of the member countries, also the Euro area and the European Union. On the next slide, you can see how it looks like for all the countries or over all of the years. So kind of the heat map giving the red color before the GFC, and then in 2009 it's kind of in a more kind of blue, and you're clearly in a recession, and also in 2020 then due to the COVID, kind of you have this blue row over all of the countries. However, in 2021, for example, there is for quite many countries the figures already kind of turned red or positive. So here we would have a quite strong rebound on besides of the composite indicator. If you compare this to the Commission's output gap estimate on the next slide, then you can see that there for 2021 we would have been, according to this methodology, below the potential already in almost all of the countries except Ireland and Slovenia or some others. If we now take the difference between the two indicators on the next slide, and we check whether the Commission's output gap is within or outside of the confidence interval, you can see that actually quite often in many cases, in almost all of the cases, the Commission's output gap is within the confidence interval or of the composite indicator. But especially in 2021, you can see that, for example, for 40% of the countries, this is not the case, which is the largest number over all of the data we have starting from 2006. So just to give you a kind of a picture of how kind of we implement the heat map for kind of to communicate to the policymakers, to the economic, to the fiscal policymakers. On the next slide, we have then a picture of the year 2006. Then on the next slide of 2009. So there you can exactly see that this is a kind of a very cold year. And then in 2021, on the next slide, you can actually see that for quite many countries, the heat map indicator has a far more positive stance than the output gap. On the next slide, to summarize, so there are some advantages of this approach. So we try to measure the business cycle phase directly, not through potential output. We get quite actual and almost real time the data. There are very few revisions only to the estimate, and it's very easy and intuitive for fiscal policymakers, which for us obviously is quite important. So the slogan would be safe in red and spend when blue. There are some disadvantages. So this is a purely empirical paper. So there comes no built-in theory with it, and we do not have any, so far, no built-in forecast for the present or for the ongoing year. So this obviously would be relevant in order to make this even more kind of suitable for policy purposes. Okay, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matthias. So we go for the fourth presentation of this session by Christian Oschner from the German Council of Economic Experts on robust output gap estimates in real time.
Thank you to the organizers. I'm very happy to be here. The research paper that I will present is joint work with Tino Berger from Göttingen University. And essentially what we do is to present a model that enables nowcasting the German output gap. The output gap, of course, is the deviation of realized output from its unobserved potential. And as such, it's a very important measure of economic slack. So positive output gaps point towards overheating and predict rising inflation, and negative output gaps indicate underutilized economic capacity. Because the German economy is the largest economy in the Eurozone, knowing the output gap in Germany is quite important for economic policy conduct. So, for example, think about decisions on interest rate hikes or on fiscal stimulus. However, real-time information about the output gap, and not only the German output gap, is very hard to come by because being intrinsically unobserved, the output gap has to be estimated, as you heard before today. But most available procedures, such as the popular filter by Hodrick and Prescott, are not super reliable in real time. So the most recent state of the output gap is often quite poorly estimated in real time, and therefore it's frequently revised ex post, and therefore it's not super useful in policy conduct. However, Morley and Wong recently suggested to use the Beveridge-Nelson decomposition, the multivariate version, not the univariate version of which Fabio showed that it performs so poorly. The multivariate Beveridge-Nelson decomposition to infer on the US output gap. And together with my co-author Tino, they extended that setup towards an outcasting model. What we do is to borrow their ideas to do some mainly technical advancements, of which I will not talk about today, and to apply these things to the German case. As it turns out, the model yields a robust estimate and a precise nowcast of the German output gap, but of course only compared to the final full sample estimate, which, I mean, the output gap in the end is still unobserved, okay? So you got to keep that in mind. The procedure, and I will be brief on that, rests on two pillars. So first of all, the economic notion of the output gap. So the deviation of realized output from its unobserved trend might be statistically operationalized with the help of the multivariate Beveridge-Nelson decomposition that essentially decomposes an integrated time series into a non-stationary trend in a stationary cycle. The Beveridge-Nelson decomposition, and this is the special thing about it, has a very intuitive definition of the trend, which is simply the long-run forecast of the underlying statistical model. And in the literature, there's some decent agreement that the Beveridge-Nelson cycle can be decently interpreted as the output gap, or at least is an output gap candidate. So this brings me to the second key element. Of course, you can evaluate the Beveridge-Nelson decomposition by means of any statistical model, but what we do is to use a mixed frequency vector autoregression. Mixed frequency models allow to infer from variation in high frequency data to low frequency economic aggregates. So for example, think about GDP as the output proxy, which is rather slow moving at a lower frequency, namely quarterly. But we have a lot of higher frequency stuff. So say in monthly frequency. So for example, labor market aggregates, industrial production, these things that might help to inform predictions of GDP at a lower frequency. So to facilitate this, high frequency aggregates can be stacked over low frequency aggregates. And this way, a nicely intuitive recursive structure emerges in the model. So we have the first month of a given quarter, this stacked over the second month, over the third month, and below we have the slow moving aggregate. And once we see the data come in the course of the quarter, so say below you have the example of January 2020, you can track the impact down to the slower moving aggregates. Also a nice thing, and let me go back to the previous slide, about the vector autoregression is that there is a very straightforward expression for the Beveridge-Nelson cycle, which is the third one. So once you know the parameters of that process, it's very easy to compute the Beveridge-Nelson cycle, and in this case, the output gap. So combining both ideas, so using a mixed frequency model to evaluate the multivariate Beveridge-Nelson decomposition allows to infer on the quarterly output gap during the course of a given quarter. So without having seen all the data of the quarter, we can elicit an outcast for the ongoing quarter. So once monthly information becomes available, we can update our conditional expectation about the output gap, which can then be used as an outcast. We select the variables by first estimating a large model, so 30-something variables, and then we only keep the variables that explain at least as much reduced form variation in the output gap as GDP does. So we get rid of most of these. So here what you can see is the red line, we normalized the amount of variation explained by GDP to be 1, and we keep only the variables of the candidate set that explain at least as much variation in the output gap, and we drop the rest. We end up specifying the model with firm and consumer expectations, as well as a handful of real financial labor market aggregates, also some trade aggregates, with a period of 1995 until 2020, and we obtain this result. So the shaded blue areas indicate 90% credible intervals, and the black line is the estimated mean output gap. As you can see, the model at first sight yields a somewhat decent result, and also the uncertainty about the estimate seems somewhat reasonable. We see some economics lag at the beginning of the new millennium, but overall not so much fluctuation prior to, or not so much fluctuation in the final years of the Great Moderation. But we also note, of course, some non-trivial overheating prior to the global financial crisis in 1928, and as severe as the subsequent downturn during the Great Recession. Finally, of course, everybody's still talking about COVID. We see somewhat unsurprisingly a sharp economic drop during the COVID-19 health crisis, with strong overheating tendencies afterwards, which probably resemble current inflationary pressures. So overall, simply by thinking economically about this thing, it seems somewhat reasonable, or it seems to be a reasonable estimate of the German business cycle for the last 27 years. A further comparison with alternative estimates support this conclusion. So as you can see, our estimate compares reasonably well with alternative estimates. For example, in green, we have the one-sided Hautic-Prespit filter, and the dotted lines are the estimates of the German Council of Economic Experts and the European Commission, which use a very similar methodology, but they are only available in yearly frequency. And for policymakers in Germany, these are really the key estimates. So nobody really cares about HP filtering here, but the European Commission and the German Council of Economic Experts really are very important to policymakers in Germany. And apart from the 2.2 and 2.3 episode at the beginning of the millennium, our estimate compares reasonably well. Still having in mind that the alternative estimates are in yearly frequency. To investigate which of the economic aggregates in this multivariate setting actually inform the output gap estimate, we decompose the reduced form variation into variable contributions. And as you can see in red, so expectations and financial and also trade stuff, so international aggregates, but most of this is world trade, are really useful to inform the German output gap estimate. And as Diebold Mariano has shown, I don't have them on the slide, but we might talk about that later. Expectations and trade also are really helpful to nowcast the output gap, which for the case of Germany, which is a very open economy, is not so surprising. So to assess the nowcasting abilities of the model, let's have a look at the COVID-19 period. The black line in all 4 panels is the full sample output gap mean. And in the upper left panel, so the dotted yellow things, is the unconditional forecast. So the forecast of the output gap when the model does not see any data of the ongoing quarter. And essentially that's mean reverting because, I mean, it's a linear model and you want it to be mean reverting. Okay, so that's cool. For instance, the unconditional forecast of 2020 Q2, so the COVID quarter, is very close to 0. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but that's here. So it's when the model does not know about COVID, it doesn't think there is anything coming. Conditional on 1 month of information, so displayed in the upper right panel, the model is at least somewhat likely to get the sign of the output gap quite right. And observing even more monthly information, so as shown in the lower panels, so 2nd month and 3rd month. And like I said, there is no quarterly movements here. So the model has not seen GDP in the 3rd month. We already obtained very precise nowcast of the output gap and still compare it to the final full sample estimate, okay? To examine how this performs in real time, because I mean, it's an estimated model and you need to re-estimate it from time to time, we do 3 little pseudo real-time experiments. So in the first row, you see the full sample estimate minus the estimate that takes into account frequent, so every quarter re-estimation of the model parameters. In the second row, you have a model that takes into account GDP data revisions. And in the final row, you have a model experiment that takes into account the real-time variable selection. So every quarter, the model is re-estimated and reselects the relevant variables relative to GDP. And as you can see from the table, so the mean difference is for the first 2 almost 0, so no revisions at all, simply due to parameter estimation and these things. And from the last column, we can see that these revisions, even though if they are somewhat larger in case of the real-time model selections, are not systematic. So I can tell you that none of these coefficients is significantly different from 0 at conventional levels. So actually the model does a very, very good job at estimating the output gap in real time compared to the final estimate. So we hope that is somewhat useful to inform economic policy in real time without having to wait for a couple of quarters until you get a decent estimate of the output gap from more conventional procedures. And we can also learn that, in fact, monthly indicators contain very useful information about the current quarter output gap. A thing to keep in mind, maybe that's interesting for some of you, expectations and trade are really useful for estimating the German output gap. Yeah, thank you for the attention.
Thank you very much, Christian. We head towards the last presentation of this session now by Bela Szörfi from the ECB on evaluating estimates of potential outputs and output gaps.
Thank you very much for having me in this workshop. Okay, so the title of this presentation is Evaluation of Output Gap Estimates, and I'm glad David spoke before me because it kind of related to what he said, and you could get a very good sense from his presentation, I think, and it's important to highlight or emphasize before I start how strong a policy focus we have here at the ECB. So whatever we produce, whenever we estimate potential output or the output gap, we need to have this policy focus in mind. We need to go to the governing council and be able to explain what we did and what these estimates show. And then basically the question is, if I show various estimates of potential output and the output gap, because there are an infinite way to estimate them, how do I tell which one are good or which one are bad? And what are the desirable properties of output gap? We put a lot of thinking into this internally and also jointly with the National Central Bank in recent years. And basically what this paper does is, departing from these desirable properties, it suggests evaluation criteria for output gap estimates, which then serve as a basis to compare different estimates. And if someone comes up with a new idea, the new way to estimate potential output, can use these criteria. This is a joint paper with a former colleague, Anna Secco-Giusto, and I'm trying to turn the page. Okay. And just to give you a summary of what we find or what we provide in the paper, as I said, we propose these assessment criteria, and then we illustrate these with a suite of models. Fabio talked about a very similar thing. We use essentially very similar models to illustrate these criteria. And then in the second part, we also assess the reliability of the estimates by international institutions. And then the main finding is that the visual inspection of output gaps is insufficient to decide if they are good or bad, and we need formal assessment. We also find that there's no single method that would produce the best output gap estimate. These methods have advantages and disadvantages. And then amongst the international institutions, perhaps this is already somewhat known, output gap estimates of the Commission revise the least, and those of the OECD revise the most. And what we show, what is I think new, is that data revisions, they do play a significant role, contrary to the literature. In addition, what is kind of dangerous is that real GDP forecast errors are transmitted into revisions of past potential output and output gap estimates. Now, just a brief overview, I'll talk about the motivation, I'll show you the evaluation criteria and the illustration. I'll save the technical details, the formulas and the detailed results. They are in the background. If the presentation will be shared, you can look into this. I'll try to be brief and non-technical. And then I also show you the reliability of the estimates of international institutions. So the motivation, you are probably somewhat familiar with these pictures, real-time estimates by many of the methods, and including those of the international institutions, the IMF, the Commission, and the OECD, sometimes are not very reliable. And then they revise a lot. This is true both for the output gap and potential growth. And also, they use different methodologies, and sometimes these estimates can very much vary. David already highlighted the output gap during COVID. You can see it also here, and also potential output. It's not just the methods, but also the concepts can be different. Like the IMF and the OECD has a very contrasting view of the COVID crisis, as David already mentioned, as you see it in these charts. So the question is, which one is better? Which one is more reliable? Which one can be used for policy purposes? And then another motivation is that there are different methods to estimate the output gaps. And quite often when we present to the Governing Council, we show a single chart or maybe two charts. So how to decide here at the expert level or even at the Governing Council level, which one is good or worse? I show you two output gap estimates. The black and the red line, they show very different output gaps. Let's say we are in 2013. The black line shows a small negative output gap. The red line shows a big negative output gap that stays negative over a projection horizon of 2 years. The red line is much more volatile. The black line is less so. So the question is, from a monetary policy point of view, which one gives a better indication about inflation? Just by looking, one would think that while the red line shows more like disinflationary pressures, maybe less inflationary pressures, the black line may be neutral. But the truth is that plugging these into reduced from Phillips curve, they provide exactly the same message or signal about inflation. And the reason is that they are perfectly correlated. One is just a linear combination of the other. So it's not sufficient just to look at the output gaps and try to figure out what they show. There's a formal assessment needed. And then, as I mentioned, departing from desired properties, we introduce 4 quantitative and 1 qualitative criteria to evaluate these different methodologies. So here are the criteria. As I said, there's a lot of information in the background, also detailed formulas. I won't go into those. The criteria are reliability. Ideally, we want the real-time estimates to not revise very much over time, because when we go to the Governing Council, we need to tell what's the situation right now. And if I tell them that, oh, actually, I know what happened 3 to 5 years ago, they are not very happy. They want to know what's going on right now. And then we want these estimates to be reliable. And we propose a couple of, actually 4 different ways to measure this. Each has disadvantages and disadvantages. Actually, this is one of the criteria that when somebody publishes a new way to estimate potential output, they look at the reliability. They say, oh, my estimate is actually quite reliable. I can compare it to an HP. But there are different ways to measure it. And then quite often people look at the average revisions. So how over a sample much these new estimates revised compared to an HP or compared to the Commission. The thing is, if you look at average revisions, there can be large positive revisions in one period, large negative revisions in other period, and they might cancel out each other. This will be the case with, for example, a simple HP filter. So one can also look at the absolute revisions, or as I showed in the motivation slide, it's also very useful to look at the correlation between the final and the real-time estimates, because from an inflationary point of view, this is what matters. One can also look at the sign change, how often these estimates change sign when a new observation becomes available, and I re-estimate the output gap. Another criteria is cyclicality. It came up already a few times this afternoon, that there might be reasons why potential growth or potential output may be cyclical. TFE was mentioned that TFE might be TFE developments might be procyclical, and then trend TFE might be procyclical. Quite often working age population and the capital stock is not filtered, introducing some cyclicality into potential output estimates. So we may want to measure how cyclical our potential output estimates are. There's nothing really new about this, but we really want to include this as an evaluation criteria because there might be preferences, both from the monetary and maybe from the fiscal policy side. The symmetry of output gap estimates could be a desirable feature. It might be desirable, especially from a fiscal policy point of view, that these output gap estimates are symmetric over an entire business cycle. This is maybe difficult to measure because we don't know when, we might not know when a business cycle might begin and end. But nevertheless, again, this is something we should be able to measure when assessing these output gap estimates. And then from a monetary policy point of view, inflation forecasting could be very important. So ideally, we expect that the output gap gives some indication about inflationary pressures looking forward a couple of quarters, maybe even 4-8 quarters. And then what is probably the hardest to measure, and we don't even propose to measure it, just this is where you can't do anything but to look at it, is the plausibility of the measures. I said we have this strong policy focus, so ideally when I show a chart to the Governing Council about potential output or the output gap, I should be able to tell a story. In the bottom, the potential output and output gap estimates we use are kind of storytelling devices. Even if they don't enter directly or don't have a big impact on macro variables in the projections, we very actively use them as a storytelling device. So if I can attach some economic stories to the estimated potential output gap and the output gap, that's desirable. If there's no story to tell, those estimates might be statistically perfect, but it's very difficult to use them for policy analysis. So these are the methods that are in the paper. These can be extended. These are selective. There are Hodrick-Prescott filters with different lambda parameters. There's the Blanchard-Gall method. The original Hamilton method, there's now an update of his paper. It's not yet included in this paper. The Beveridge-Nelson, Christian Fitzgerald, the Yaroshinsky-Lenza model, a survey-based measure of slack, which is a bivariate statistical filter, and a bigger unobserved components model of Mateto that David mentioned. We estimate them over a sample, pre-COVID sample, and then where needed, for example, for inflation forecasting or for the revisions, there are subsamples and quasi-real-time estimates created. We don't use real vintages, and the reason is that here we are interested in the uncertainty or the reliability related to the methods themselves. I will show in the second part that data revisions can have a huge role, but we cannot do anything about it. If Eurostat or the Statistical Office revises the underlying data, I cannot really do anything about that. I'm interested in which method produces more reliable, better inflation forecast, given the model and the parameters, and not looking at the revisions of the underlying data. So I have more detailed results in the background again with the detailed numbers, but maybe just to summarize the findings is that the average revisions, looking at the average revisions, the HP filter doesn't seem to revise much actually. But the reason is that this masks larger revisions, at least in the euro area, for the pre-financial crisis and the post-financial crisis period. So it's very important to look at the absolute revisions. The Yaroshinsky-Lenza method, that revises actually a lot. On average, more than 1 percentage point. So the real-time estimates, if you just look at the level of the real-time estimates, one might conclude that they are not very reliable. And in general, the revisions are larger in the pre-2013 period. If I look at these absolute revisions, where I take basically the absolute value of the revisions, it turns out that the HP filter actually does revise a lot. And then the Yaroshinsky-Lenza model continues to revise. But then if I look at the correlation, which is what matters in a reduced for Phillips curve, it turns out that the Yaroshinsky-Lenza estimate revises such that these estimates, when they revise, they shift up or down, and they remain fairly strongly correlated with the original. So the final remains correlated with the real-time estimate, which is a good sign for monetary policy and for inflation forecasting. Yeah, I'll skip this sign change thing, because what I want to talk about is this next slide. So quite often when we talk about the cyclicality of potential growth estimates, it could be desirable that also, given what David says, we have this medium-term concept of potential growth. We might prefer to have potential growth estimates that are not very pro-cyclical, that they are more stable over time and really reflect the kind of the structural developments in the economy. At the same time, we might want to see stable output gap estimates that do not really revise over time. But as I show here, especially on the right, on this chart, that there is a trade-off between the two. You can very nicely illustrate that with an HP filter with different lambdas. So a more cyclical potential growth estimate results in smaller revisions of the output gap, and vice versa, less cyclical potential growth estimates result in more revisions of the output gap. So it's kind of difficult to satisfy both conditions. There might be methods like the unobserved components or maybe the Beveridge-Nelson model that can do both reasonably well, but in most cases, you have to choose between these two desirable properties. I quickly show you the inflation forecasting performance. The thing is, if you use real GDP growth in a reduced from Phillips curve as a baseline, basically all output gap estimates that I show here improve the inflation forecast. And the Yaroshinsky, Lenza, Christianov-Fitzgerald models, they do particularly well. And then the unobserved components model of thought, it also does very well, especially 2 quarter ahead. The root mean squared error is reduced by 35, almost 40%. And then the fourth criteria is plausibility. I won't go into much details. You see here the estimates. I just want to highlight maybe, you see the HP filter, even though it doesn't really have very desirable statistical properties, it still shows a smooth potential growth estimates. I can attach the story. There's a potential growth that has been declining in the beginning of the 2000s. And then you see some impact from the financial crisis. And then there's some recovery after that. Even though it's just a simple statistical filter, doesn't embed a lot of information, it still gives kind of a narrative that I can live with. If you look at the Blanchard co-estimate, potential growth is very volatile. It's difficult to tell a story with that. And the same is true for the Hamilton filter. So the Hamilton output gap in itself, it might look okay, but potential growth from a Hamilton filter, at least applied to the euro area, is not something that I would be able to explain. Maybe it's not a coincidence that Hamilton himself didn't show potential growth in his original paper. Okay, and then just to close this first part, basically one can rank these methods. The ranking can be subjective, but given the relevance of these criteria, one can rank the methods and maybe select those that are the best performers. Now, interestingly, the Hamilton would be statistically the best because it's not cyclical and it's symmetric. It reasonably does well in inflation forecasting, but it's not plausible. I highlighted the ones that can be plausible. Again, that is something subjective. And in this respect, maybe it's the UCM and the Yaroshinsky-Lenza method that are kind of good performers. But as you clearly see, there's not a single one that would stand out and you would say, okay, this is absolutely the best model. And then what can be done with these methods is to show the range of these methods, to illustrate the model uncertainty. And in these charts, I show what is generally done here internally. We use the range of these estimates, and you can actually narrow it down just by showing those that are plausible or show those that are also good inflation forecasters. And then I'll spend a little time and then I finish on these international institution estimates. The second part of the paper looks into the reliability of estimates by international institutions. We look at real vintages. And then what we find is that the European Commission's estimates are the most stable, and then the OECD estimates are the least reliable. I think what's kind of new is that we also decompose these revisions in the output gap into revisions of real GDP growth, that is further decomposed into data revisions and Nyquist errors, plus revisions of potential growth and revisions of the initial output gap. And then what we find is that actually data revisions, they do play a significant role. These are the green bars here, and this shows the euro area. As you see, especially in the early 2000s, there are large positive green bars. So the underlying real GDP data, they were revised significantly. And this also led big revisions in the output gaps. But then potential growth was also revised strongly, especially in case of the OECD. And this Nyquist error if real GDP is fairly small. And then if I want to understand why potential growth is revised, that again can be explained by data revisions and also some kind of a forecast error. So here what I'm curious about is, if I forecast real GDP and I turn out to be wrong, does that affect past estimates of potential output? So for example, if real GDP turns out to be much worse than I forecasted 2 years ahead, does that influence the past estimates of potential output, and does that contribute to the instability of the estimates? And it turns out that yes, indeed, this is the case. So data revisions again play a significant, statistically significant role. And in case of the IMF and the OECD, this forecast error also plays a significant role. And unfortunately, this real GDP forecast error is then transmitted into potential growth estimates and the revisions of them. This is less so the case for the European Commission. So basically, to conclude, as I said, data revisions do play a significant role in output gap and potential growth revisions. There's not much we can do about it other than acknowledging it. We should be careful not to transmit real GDP forecast errors into potential growth and output gap revisions. We should be mindful about revising the history of these estimates if we make a forecast error. Sometimes this is easier said than done because these filters many use have this kind of automatic property to revise the past, but one can apply then judgment. And this is especially uncertain to do in periods with large supply shocks like the COVID and the war. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I'm seeing several questions from the chat already. Let me first, what I see is that in many of the presentations, you've actually used similar filters and from different angles. So I would like to maybe first give you all the panelists some opportunity to comment on other panelists' presentations. Maybe, I don't know, what Fabio thinks of this last presentation or what Christian found about these other presentations. If you just, let me give you a minute if you want to react, any of you.
I think I leave the space to everybody else. So I'm not
okay. Okay. No, actually, one of the questions from the chat was directed straight to you, Fabio, against your just answer. Whether how do you view comprehensive evaluation exercises like we've just seen? No, how will they match your own views? If you
so let me just start the video. So I think my exercise is very specific, meaning. Within a DSG, within a new Keynesian framework, how do you get closer to what theory explains? So my valuation criteria are basically based on something that is built into the new Keynesian model. If you don't want to condition on any model, then you have to devise some statistics that are meaningful and interpretable. Now, obviously, forecasting performance is one. Something that you're be interested. Cyclicality is another one that I think could be interested. Revision, I'm not sure it's the criteria that I personally use because even if there are no data revision, these things will revise. For example, the HP filter will revise quite a lot the estimates. So I'm not sure that that's a comparable metric. But in general, I think you need to decide, within the community, what is it that you want to use? What is a relevant criteria? And I think we have seen few views here. It'd be interesting to know what other people think about, a common set of statistics that could be used to do this kind of exercise. Thanks.
Thank you. Unless there is any immediate reaction, I'll go to some of the questions. There was
I could
yeah.
comment quickly on kind of the kind of continuous revisions of the output. Well, in my perspective, kind of I would consider this to be a quite important kind of characteristic, because especially coming from a fiscal policy evaluation or monitoring background, it is very, very hard to communicate to fiscal policy makers why the output gap and maybe sometimes even the sign of the output gap revises even in hindsight. So it makes it impossible to kind of give a plausible kind of ex ante picture of the output gap or the business cycle phase and the fiscal stance. If kind of a year later or half a year later or 1.5 years later, you tell politicians then, well, at the time we told you the output gap was negative, but now it seems to be positive. So the fiscal policy you did last year and the budget decisions you took based on this assessment, kind of they were flawed because, well, we just the output gap revised. So in a fiscal policy context, it is of key importance to kind of develop methods and to develop output gap estimates which do not revise, or which do not revise so heavily that kind of the conclusions you would draw for fiscal policy and maybe even also for monetary policy change. Thank you.
Can I respond to this? A second. So I think this is not a good criteria. I mean, policymakers should learn about uncertainty. You know, all these estimates have uncertainty around there. If they are revised, it's because there is a lot of uncertainty about them. So they should base their decision on a risk management type of assessment. So this is a point estimate. There is a standard error attached to it. They have to learn to live with it. If they are revised over time, well, that's what you know, life is about. It's about new information coming in, having better estimates, better information. So I think it is not a problem of economists. It's a problem of policymakers, that they don't understand or they don't conceive estimates as being a random variable with a distribution on it. And what we typically report are simply point estimates of this distribution.
If I may to add to this, I would really agree with Fabio here that and there could also be a difference between fiscal and monetary policy. And I think fiscal policy might be more obsessed with the exact level of the output gap because they want to know the cyclical position of the economy exactly, to know whether they need what type of policy they need to pursue. And this can be very different as the data revises. And I think monetary policymakers, in my experience, could also be too much obsessed with the point estimates. But in that case, as I showed, if one kind of uses reduced from Phillips curves as well, policymakers also need to understand that it might not actually matter what the current output gap is, strictly from an inflationary point of view. Okay, here at the ECB, we do not forecast inflation just with a reduced from Phillips curves, but they do use reduced from Phillips curves to cross-check inflation estimates, plugging in those output gaps. And as I showed, there's the Yarochinsky-Lenza method, which is a very good forecaster of inflation, but the real time differs very much from the final estimates. You wouldn't want to use that for fiscal policy because you had no idea in real time what the output gap is. And I fully agree, policymakers maybe need to learn to live with these properties of these estimates. And of course, another solution would be if experts come up with something that is fully reliable, either doesn't revise or are able to explain what exactly the inflationary pressure or the fiscal policy prescription is, but that's maybe equally challenging.
I think, for example, the picture that you show at the end, where you have the range of estimates, I mean, that's informative. You know, you can show people what's the maximum and the minimum at each point in time, and they should learn to understand that this is the true uncertainty that we face when we build these estimates.
Well, if I might comment, so the kind of the point of our paper was to kind of try to come up with a method to directly measure the cycle, which actually doesn't revise very much. So, well, we hope that there is kind of some progress kind of happening on that front. With regard to, I mean, I'm not an expert on monetary policy, but let me tell you this: that it is, I can assure that it is very, very hard to communicate to fiscal policymakers kind of why the gap revises all the time. And obviously, I fully agree with Fabio on that it's kind of important to stress that kind of these are point estimates, and kind of in our paper, this is why we kind of always communicate also the confidence interval or the error which comes with it, but large revisions, especially in sign, are very hard to communicate to fiscal policymakers. But maybe we overcome it with our paper.
Thank you. While you were discussing, there's some questions accumulating here. So let me go in order. There was an initial one for David from Michaela, saying that the long-run effects operating through the innovation margin of TFP will only be visible over the medium term. So ruling out long-term scarring on TFP is premature at the current juncture, and she advised to closely monitor innovation-related indicators such as business, research and development expenditure, and other innovation-related expenditure on the firm level, but also on the positive TFP effect on digitalization. She claims that we also need micro evidence on this issue, and she gives some references. So, David, I don't know if you want to react on this.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Eva. No, Michaela, I think we are fully on one page, and I'm not sure whether maybe I was not clear here. I didn't rule out any scarring effects, neither from the pandemic nor from the energy price shock. What I was merely saying is that, and it was probably also going back to the discussion in the first panel, that especially on the factor labor, we don't see, where things are much more measurable than on other components of potential output, we don't see much scarring yet. No, there's not one dimension, be it the unemployment rate, the participation, whatever, where we really can say there's scarring, right? But for sure, especially on TFP, we don't know yet. No, I mean, clearly also the containment measures, the supply chain disruptions, the finding of governments and firms that when things are needed, sometimes they cannot produce certain important goods, right? Might lead to some renationalization of some global value chain, and that's probably not productivity enhancing. So obviously there can be some scarring effects, and also I didn't want to overpaint a positive picture for digitalization. But my point was that from all these indicators, so far we don't see much arguments for strong scarring yet. But that does not mean that this is not coming still. So I fully agree. Shall I maybe also just get back to Ernest, because he put a question in the chat.
Yeah, I was going to go ahead. If you want to read it and answer, go ahead. I was going to pass it.
I have to read it. Okay, yeah, sure. No, I mean, I think Ernest basically asked why we don't publish potential output and output gaps, and that this might tie in well for sort of the approach of steering expectations through a reaction function, and whether this is maybe partly relating to maybe Bela's presentation, and I think I showed it as well, that we had many potential output measures that we potentially can look at and that inform us in the policy making. I mean, I think this is a very good question. I think partly I would need to probably give it back to you, because these are Eurosystem estimates that we developed together with the central bank, so it would need to be a common decision to publish them or not. It's also probably fair to say that we do, as you know better than I do, a very detailed forecast, and we don't publish all our estimates on all variables. So it's a select set of variables that we deem most useful. And then I think it's also probably useful to point to some of the other institutions' decision lately. I think, and Bela can second me here, I think the OECD scrapped their NAIRU forecast lately, and also the Fed, I think, sort of stopped producing that, at least publicly, or gave some weight on that for their reaction function. I think it's probably going back to the question of uncertainty, but I think we had this discussion right now, and I fully agree that a range of indicators still helps. But again, here, I mean, I think we publish, at least sometimes we publish ranges of plausible potential output estimates in our bulletin article. There was one during COVID, there was one before, so I think that can probably help in informing at least partly what is sort of the Eurosystem assessment in a broader sense.
Okay. Thank you. There's one question for Bela on your presentation by Davide Delle Monache. He's asking regarding your features to assess different measures of your output gap estimates. He's saying that first, if you want to minimize the revisions, then you should use the one-sided filter. Otherwise, you will have always revisions. And he's not really sure that revision is such a bad property. And also, second, regarding the symmetry, he's saying that he's not completely sure that the ideal cycle should be symmetric, as we know from last episodes, that recessions are wider than expansions. Bela?
Yes, thank you. Now, the problem with the one-sided filter is that it then conflicts with our, if we desire to have a smooth trend estimate. No, one-sided filters, I think, produce more volatile trend estimates, and then again, it might be different to explain. And also, I might be interested in the two-sided estimates for the entire history, because I might want to see the output gap now, looking back. I mean, how do I explain this better? I want to see the past basically from now, and I want to know how do I look at the past. The one-sided filter basically shows the kind of the real-time estimates. That's true, but it shows how I saw it in real time. Maybe I want to see the history as I see it now, given all the changes also in the model. But that's true. The one-sided filters estimates, they do not revise even just the HP filter. And then the second one, the symmetry. True, it might be true also in practice that that maybe contractions are deeper and shorter than booms or recovery periods. But I think this is again something fiscal policy might desire, to have symmetric output gap estimates and to kind of have symmetric prescriptions for fiscal policy in terms of accommodation and restrictions. So again, this is why I showed this table in the end. You can, if you have these criteria, you can give some weights to them. If you say actually symmetry is not so relevant for me, you can give a low weight or exclude it, and then kind of weight the others, and then to see which one is kind of more desirable for you or not. And this relates back to the comment to Arto. That right, policymakers, they want to make decisions in real time and they need some indicators. And I think what I wanted to say is basically that yes, maybe you have one single method that you use, and this is the headline estimate. As in case of the ECB, we have the BMP estimates. But then it's really advisable, in my view, to look at these ranges to know what the estimates that form the range, how do they look like? What are their properties? How do they revise? How good the inflation forecast they provide, etc. And then to say this range shows maybe upside or downside risks compared to the baseline, or the baseline is within the range, so maybe it's more reliable. Because otherwise, if policymakers rely on a single estimate in real time and then it turns out to be a wrong indicator of inflation, or it turns out to be a wrong indicator of the cycle, then we are in trouble. So the aim was to show that you can build these ranges, but you also have to know what the properties of the estimates forming the range are.
May I comment that a bit? Thanks very much, and I of course understand very well the revisions, and it's a difficult thing. The only point maybe is that just saying that because in our methods, our economist statistician methods, we get revisions, I'm not so sure that the decision makers like still that. They are saying that we have to make the decisions, please give us better estimates. And that's what we try to do. And I think there was a wonderful another nowcast paper. So we have to pay attention to that as well. Thank you.
Yes, yeah, okay, absolutely. Just to your other question, I see there's another question from you in the chat. Yeah, these are two different things. So I had two different things in that panel explaining the revisions to potential. But one was data revisions, and that was statistically significant across all institutions. So the EC does take into account the statistical data revisions. What the EC estimates are more kind of resilient to are these real GDP forecast errors. So if I now forecast real GDP 2 years ahead into 2025, and then the 2025 growth turns out to be much worse than I forecasted, then I might revise potential growth for 2021, 2, 3. And I want to maybe avoid that because COVID is a clear example. COVID was a sudden shock, unexpected shock, hitting in the spring of 2020. It should not impact the potential output estimates of 2019. I don't want it to revise, but still my forecast for real GDP forecast for 2020 and 2021 was entirely wrong. So if I transmit this forecast error into potential output estimates of 2017, 18, 19, that's not very desirable because COVID in principle shouldn't affect those estimates. And the Commission does kind of a good job in this respect, the OECD and the IMF not so much.
May I again comment a bit? Thanks a lot. That's a good explanation. It opens it up. It gives more information. At the same time, I would be very worried if we will have potential output estimates which doesn't come from some methodology. I mean, if we make them subjectively, and with our comparison, because we have the business cycle direct measurement, and if you have observed GDP, you can always derive the third out. I mean, the potential in our case. And we are not very sure that the EC potential output estimates look very plausible in 21, for instance. It seems that the potential output for some European countries was going higher growth. Potential output was getting higher growth after COVID. And I'm not believing in that. And in a way, it sounds a little bit that you were fiddling with something, that it doesn't come from the statistical methodology or the model methodology. And this is worrisome, because after that, it's impossible to have, for instance, fiscal policy rules that are based on some objective potential output.
Let me add one more element to this discussion from the audience, from Martin Lark, both Duarto and Matthias. He's saying that in some very small and open economies, there are even good reasons to believe that potential is volatile, and in that case, it may not be a good anchor for fiscal policy.
Matthias, do you want to come out with that, or shall I reflect?
Yeah, you can take it.
Yes, I thank you, Martin. I think this is a good point, and this kind of gives support to us that, you know, if all the potential output estimates are very volatile, as we can see in the European Independent Fiscal Institution network, for instance, it's very difficult to derive output gap estimates via those. And that's why it might be a better idea, particularly for small open economies or all open economies, to try to somehow nowcast the business cycle position directly. That's what we try to do. Thank you.
There's barely no time, but I wanted to ask one thing to Christian and maybe also Matthias. I thought what I noticed is that basically the bands, the confidence, this is a question by myself, what the bands around the estimates do not change that much over time. And I was expecting in this precisely thinking about real-time estimates of at times of large shocks. I was expecting like big strings in the width of the confidence intervals. So yeah, is there anything you can comment on this, either Christian or Matthias or well, whoever? This was common to several presentations, by the way.
Sure, Bela. If you remember, for example, the graph where we had the quarterly data at the end, actually, where inflation surges and consumer confidence plunges, you can actually quite directly see that the confidence interval widens quite drastically. So I think it's at least 1.5 times larger than in 2019, for example. And the same goes also for the great financial crisis and also for the COVID crisis. So at least on the quarterly level, you see that.
For my part, In this particular case, it's rather a model feature simply because we regularize the parameters, and that purges a lot of the credible interval movements, at least in the outer quantiles. However, if you and this is, I can simply report this from my personal testing with the model. If you don't do that, you don't really have super large fluctuations, because in that particular model you estimate the gap from a cross section, and even though there is some variation or some revision in some of the series, there is not necessarily say that the same kind of noise common to all of the series. So even though some series go nuts, the remainder of the cross section can stabilize the estimate.
Okay, I think we should stop here. I thank you very much, all 5 presenters and co-authors, and for all the questions from the audience. And I'll pass the word to Ernest to close this exciting workshop.
This concludes our workshop on measuring economic slack and shortages, new methods and ways forward. I honestly still need to digest the full content of all presentations, but I already take along a few key insights. Recent multiple shocks and the strong rise in inflation have spurred an interest in and work on estimates of potential output and the output gap. A lot of very thorough work is obviously currently being conducted in the Eurosystem and elsewhere. One needs to recognize explicitly the large uncertainties, model, method, data dependency of all estimates, and deal with their uncertainty in a structured way. And if I take along already now that scarring is a much discussed issue, but again, gauging its extent is quite difficult in practice. To conclude, let me thank all our speakers for sharing your deep knowledge with us. Thanks also to the moderators for steering us through these complex questions. You did a masterful job. And to all of you for your interest and for joining us today. Bye-bye and take care. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.